And we're live! Hello folks, welcome. Hello folks, the rumours of my retirement were greatly exaggerated. By me! Oh, I had to do something for April Fool's Day, so... Can you compound Caprotti valve gear? Valve gear is just valve gear. I don't think it has any effect on whether or not a locomotive can be compounding. To tell you the truth, I couldn't tell you. I'm not an expert on steam locomotives. I am a fan. I am a history and train buff, not a history and train expert, sadly. Welcome everybody. It is once again nice to see you all here again. The rumours of my death were exaggerated. I only got eviscerated, not annihilated. What's a more terrifying of a design to have 4 Ranger class carriers or 4 North Carolinas? 4 North Carolinas, because it doesn't matter they've got 14-inch guns, they're still brutally effective warships. The fact they have quad 14s is irrelevant. They will be just as effective as they were if they had triple 16s. And the US has 2 extra fast battleships. Whoopee. For the extra CV, they're fucking Ranger. They have no torpedo magazine, and they're vulnerable to being sneezed on by a particularly loud and aggressive bird. So, yeah, there's that. Okay, Ranger's hull's not that bad. Let's not oversell the point. Is there any ship class where you would have liked lower main caliber guns compared to the originals? No, honestly, not that I can think of. Romanoff asks, what are some advantages and disadvantages to squeezing as many guns as possible in the least number of turrets? French quad turret designs spring to mind. Well, it's not. It comes down to displacement. Two turrets with 8 guns is always going to weigh less than 4 turrets with 8 guns. As in, 8 guns arranged in 2 quads is going to weigh less than 8 guns arranged in 4 twins. Because while the weight roughly might not be that much less overall, e.g. the 2 quad turrets might only weigh slightly less than the 4 twins, you save weight in other areas. You've shortened your citadel massively, which will save a ton of weight. you remove the need for barbettes for super firing, which will save more weight. Disadvantages: if you have quad turrets, you're liable to lose more of half your main battery or a large chunk of your main battery if you lose a gun. I think I basically summed it up. Saratoga's built... Well, first off, they're the Lexingtons, not the Saratogas. But the Lexingtons built as battle cruisers basically would be useless. Well, as built, they'd be the worst protected warships in the world. Some of the fastest capital ships, but some of the worst protected. Although that wouldn't last, the US would probably rebuild them in the 30s to be quasi-fast battleships for carrier escort work. And in that role, they'd be much superior to the Conquerors, which would be the only things that would catch them. Further names for US battlecruisers if they were built? I have no idea. I don't know. To tell you the honest truth, you'd have to go and look that one up, because I don't know where I'd find the information for that. How many 5-inch 38 can you slap on Saratoga? Well, on a Lexington, you could slap a fair amount. They're very long ships. They've only got 8. They've only got 4 twins. You're looking at probably. Let me think. Probably something in the range of 12 to 10 to 12 guns per side. So about 8 to 10 mounts per side, because just how long the ships would be. Do you think the CVA 58 design is going to be a better design than the Forrestal class? I have no idea what the CVA 58 is. Let me just have a look. Oh, you mean USS United States? No, she was going to be worse. Forrestal. Yeah, Gunnery Officer, that really confused me. You said is going to be a better design. You should say would have been a better way to phrase that, because you really threw me for a loop there. No, the CVA 58 was worse in every metric than the Forrestals. The Forrestals were just better in every way than the United States. If the Courageous class large light cruisers had a single 4-gun turret arm for the same number of 15-inch cannons but with one less turret, would it be a worse ship compared to the disaster it already was before the carrier conversion? Well, okay. First things first. The Courageous, while flawed and while somewhat shaking themselves to bits when firing their guns, are not the worst warships ever created. That honour belongs to other vessels. A quad turret aft, they don't have the width for it, for one thing. Secondly, the British don't have a quad mount just on the drawing board, period. They don't, heck, the British don't have a bloody triple mount on the drawing board at this point. They're getting towards there, they get there in a few years' time. So, also, they're supposed to be large light cruisers, they're supposed to be dealing with German light forces. Not having any guns of a large caliber forward is kind of a disadvantage to that role. Would it be possible to equip the Gearings and Allen N. Sumners with the 5-inch 54s from the Montanas and the Midways? Well, first off, we don't know if the Montana was going to carry 5-inch 54s. It's likely the Montanas would have carried 5-inch 38s. Since that's what their design documents were all designed around. Secondly, though, that aside, no, you can't re-equip the Gearings and the Allen Summons with a 5-inch 54 mount. don't think it quite works. Basically down to the fact that if it could have been done, given how long those ships served for in both the USN and other navies, it would have been done. The fact that they stuck with their twin 5-inch 38s for their entire service careers leads me to believe that it was physically impossible to fit 5-inch 54 on those ships, or the cost was so prohibitive they just chose not to. What would be the British version of the Montana class or the Yamato? Their super battleship. Well, first off, the Montanas weren't really a super battleship, they were just... It's important to recognise that the Iowas were a step away from US battleship design. They were actually a diversion of the line of advance. So it goes North Carolina, South Dakota, Montana. The Iowas are like a stepchild off the main branch. As they were fast battleships rather than traditional slower vessels that like the keeping the 28 knot battle line speed the US was going for with the Sodaks, the NoCals. If the only ships that the British were planning on building with 18-inch guns were some variants of the Lions. But again, I disagree with this whole definition of super battleship. I think that the term is reductive. I think it's a very silly term. All the Yamatos are is just larger than average battleships. They're not these super duper battleships. Montana isn't, Yamato isn't. They're just larger battleships. They're not super in any way.
They're generally also, at least by pre-World War II standards, still fast battleships.
Yeah.
Because they're 25 knots plus.
Yeah,
like
everyone,
Yamato's 27 knots.
Yeah,
Montana's about the same.
Yeah, everyone forgets that Yamato's actually pretty nippy for a ship, especially for something her size.
Like, of the actual Japanese battleships, because I do agree with Drac on this, and it was even before I met him, but the Congos are battle cruisers.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like,
they can change the name, they can change the armor profile, or their ability to fly other capital ships. Quite right.
Yeah. Of the actual Japanese battleships, the Yamatos are the fastest.
The Nagatos are nipping at their heels, but then it's still, again, it's only nipping at the heels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
So go on, you're clearly going somewhere with this.
the Yamatos have other problems, but incredibly short barrel lives. So the crews didn't really do much gunnery training for like live fire. They did everything up to the live fire, but live fire for them was quite rare because of that. So, John, the Alaskas were viewed as surplus to requirements because everything they could do, the Iowas could do better.
And only, what was it?
And
50% extra running costs, which is kind of
and when you look at the heavy surface ship threat post World War II, not considering the British and the French, who already have serious problems against the U.S. Navy, because there was a short period where the French were actually considered a potential threat.
Yeah, the French went through a phase.
Well, through
they're always going
through to the 60s, the U.S. Army aggressor force was this very interesting thing that was heavily French themed. But when you look at the Soviets, it's the Sverdlovs. And realistically, I don't think I need to explain what's going to happen if a Sverdlov meets a Baltimore, or worse, a Des Moines, let alone in Iowa.
Yeah.
It's just Romanov, there's really no way to answer that because the Yamato class battleships were better warships and they were producing them as fast as they could produce realistically any battleship.
Oh yeah.
So the Yamatos were pretty much the best the IJN could get. That was their point.
And it was entirely the right decision to go with those capital ships. It was entirely the right decision. Given the knowledge they had at the time, given strategic thinking, given the way all navies of the world the IJN made entirely the right decision to jump ahead, to build big, to try and get a jump on increasing the size of capital ships. Because I'm sick of hearing the constant, just cancel the Yamatos and build more carriers. Because that's just... No, please stop.
Did they make the right decision converting Shinano? They made the decision they had to make.
Me and Drac have often posited, separately and at the same time, the fact that obviously it was a decision they made, but personally I think they would have been better finishing her as a battleship. A third Yamato would bluntly be more used to them than whatever the fuck Shinano was, and she'd be available earlier for operations.
In hindsight, yes.
Yeah, I'm talking purely in hindsight, not at the time.
Yeah, at the time it was a decision they had to make, because they had just gotten their carriers curb stomped. But the real Congos, they needed them as fast capital ships.
Only fast capital ships the Japanese Navy ever possessed. As in 30 knots plus.
The IJN took stock of the situation post-Midway and realized they needed a lot more carriers. But what they didn't realize is that their pilot training was so far behind the curve of replacements that Turpitz, it's not really about AA boost. Japanese defensive tactics, procedures, both in fighter control and in just air raid detection and AA direction and stuff like that was just bad. Like, it was bad. Irrespective of equipment, you could have given them the 40 millimeter Bofors and it still would have been bad. There's a point in the Indian Ocean raid where they don't realize they're under air attack until the bombs start exploding around them from Blenheims. Their cap never picked them up. Their air watchers never picked them up. The first indication they had that they were under attack was after the Blenheims had already dropped their payloads.
And were bugging off.
Yeah. That was broad daylight, too.
Stealth Blenheims, you see, secret weapon. I jest, but... I can't really speak to that, Gunnery Officer. To tell you the truth, I'm not very good with minutiae of the Pacific War or World War II in general.
That's a Phoenix question.
Yeah, as I've
among
stated,
others.
I am not Drac. These little tidbits of knowledge are not things I would know or have access to. I'm a very good generalist, but I'm not a very good specialist.
So, John, it came down to an issue with the IFF and radar. As well as radar of the period itself isn't perfect. Still isn't today. You can have atmospheric conditions that cause gaps. You can have things where IFF returns from large friendly formations cause problems. There was actually an incident in Syria where a hostile drone snuck in behind the IFF blip of an American drone, and that's how several American service personnel were killed in Syria. This also applied in World War II. It's just as you have a whole strike package forming up from a 4-carrier strike fleet, their task group in World War II. Your vector that's not really covered well by your radar is even bigger. Um, so
Um,
radar detectors aren't really going to help you in a surface ship role. The reason the Germans did that on their U-boats was to give the U-boats early warning to dive. It's not really going to help in a context of a carrier group trying to pick up an inbound air attack, because broadly speaking, air attacks didn't come in with radar.
USN radar-equipped aircraft operating off their carriers were, I think, purely fighters during the period of.
No, there were some early Avenger like AEW,
Oh wow, I
and
didn't
sea
know
aircraft.
that. Didn't know that.
And then there were some fighters equipped for night fighter duties. There were some Avengers that would use it to guide in attacks as well, but those were pretty rare. Didn't really have a meaningful impact. It was more the U.S. Navy sort of experimenting and figuring out night carrier tactics.
There's a lot of
It wasn't like the Atlantic U-boat War where, you have these multi-engine patrol aircraft combing the seas hunting, and it's too late by the time the U-boat spots them. They're going to get hit. Particularly, they're going to get hit with typically airdropped acoustic homing torpedoes. So if they're on the surface and the aircraft is able to detect them, they are dead. This is something a lot of people forget about the Atlantic U-boat War, is the Germans lost a lot of U-boats to these sorts of air attacks, and they were the most effective way of dealing with the U-boats. The submarine war was completely different in the Pacific. The Japanese weren't really interested in doing commerce warfare, and to be honest, there wasn't any opportunity for them to do it, like, at all.
There's no real
So
to interdict.
So, gunnery officer, it's because World War II sonars on destroyers were by and large, they're using it 22 knots. A, they're incredibly close to their target. B, they're using active sonar. And most modern sonars that you hear people talking about being used are passive. Now, there's a shift back towards active sonar, particularly low-frequency active sonar today, because it is very useful at detecting submarines at extended ranges as well, particularly if you have a variable depth system, because you can stick that below the layer or into a duct and really hammer and get returns that way. But you got to keep in mind that detection ranges in World War II are a few hundred yards.
And it's also important to bear in mind that unless that U-boat is near the surface and has an acoustic torpedo loaded into a tube that's pointing in roughly your direction, you don't have to worry about return fire. It's not like in the later Cold War period where if a war had gone hot and you're prosecuting a submarine contact and you're banging away on active as either a submerged submarine or...
You're probably getting a wake-homing torpedo shoved up your butt.
Yeah. Whereas in
like,
World War II, the chances of that are much, much rarer. Because in the late... do you mind if I... You can correct
yeah, go ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong later, but I just wanted to say what I think is... Because there's also a danger if you go active in the Cold War period, given the increased range of weaponry, that you can go active, someone else will hear your active sonar, but you will not get a return. And then they know where you are, and you don't know, and
Well, they know the bearing that you're down, and they probably can figure out roughly what kind of ship you are based on the kind of active sonar you just hit them with, frequency-wise.
Yep.
This is not a good situation. The other thing is, so detection ranges for and engagement ranges for subs in World War II are effectively point blank. You're right on top of the enemy. In some cases, with literally. Even in 1948 to 1952, you're now looking at 1,000 yards, 2,000 yards. And around the mid 50s, now you're starting to talk about 8,000 yards, 10,000 yards. By the 70s and 80s, you're potentially talking 20,000 yards. So all of this dramatically changes how things are approached.
And of course, there's one of the reasons why the safest way to prosecute a submerged submarine from basically up until today is an aircraft. Because I can't think of any submarines that carry anti-aircraft weapons that can be fired while submerged. And the aircraft doesn't have to worry about banging away with active sonar or listening with passive, because it doesn't matter if you know where the aircraft sonar buoys are. You can't attack the aircraft. There's a reason why frigates and destroyers started to carry helos for ASW work. Like, the helo can go out and search, it increases the area which you can search, and
generally speaking, a helo isn't going to be out doing searching. You're gonna launch your helo, and the helo is gonna help you nail down that contact and then prosecute the contact.
Would it? So is it basically up to captain's discretion whether the surface vessel, be it a frigate or a destroyer, prosecutes the contact with its weaponry, or if the helo prosecutes the contact?
Whoever's in charge of the engagement. Yeah, that's not always the captain of the vessel conducting the actual engagement, but it's whoever's in charge of the engagement.
Are there any factors that go into that, or is it just does it matter?
Chain of command.
No, I was more referring to what gets to prosecute the contact.
Yeah, it depends. Like it depends on the situation at hand.
Fair enough. I mean, yeah, if you fire a surface-to-air missile and you miss, the enemy knows exactly where you are. If you somehow...
Well, even if you hit it, right?
Yeah.
And, keep in mind that a maritime patrol aircraft, the entire crew, right, unless they're heads down in a scope, they're looking out a window, scanning the surface of the ocean. So what do you think is going to be the first reaction of that aircraft when you launch what's going to have to be a heat-seeking missile at them?
It is going to break hard and pop flares.
It's going to dump probably about half of its flares, and by the time you're ready to re-engage with another SAM, you already have a torpedo pinging away at you in the water.
And at that point, you have to go evasive.
Which means you can't fire, because now you got water resistance over your torpedo tubes. Because you've got to go to flank.
You have no choice at that point. Your typical officer asks, did the introduction of helos in naval warfare in the 50s make it easier to find subs in terms of ASW?
They helped a lot, because they gave surface ships their own air support. They helped. Now, you'd need the fielding of sonobuoys, you'd need dipping sonar, you'd need a whole bunch of other things, but at a minimum, they gave you a standoff torpedo employment weapon, beyond just weapon alpha or something like that. They gave you a really good way of engaging at extended range. So there's that. Well, okay. Azrock is interesting, but like,
I mean, if you boil down Azrock to its barest nub, it's a torpedo on top of a rocket that you lob in a certain direction.
yeah.
Obviously it's got guidance to make sure it lands in roughly the right area, but at the end of the day, it is torpedo on top of rocket you yeet at a submarine that's in the distance.
On Dash, given that its primary weapon was a nuclear depth bomb that had to be armed on the deck of the ship, and was set to explode at a certain depth, and Dash had a huge problem with crashing on landing and takeoff.
What is that monstrosity?
This is how to kill yourself 101. Now, with a conventional depth bomb, or later on the lightweight torpedo that it could carry, it's fine. But with its originally intended weapon, you're playing Russian roulette. Because if that depth bomb gets dropped next to the ship, even if your ship is already at flank speed, you are not getting far enough away.
A lot of people experimented with hydrogen peroxide turbine-equipped submarines. The British had one. We called it HMS Explorer. There is a reason it had a nickname, the Exploder. They were not very successful boats because, well, they tended to have horrible accidents a lot of the time. Because hydrogen peroxide is a terrible, terrible thing that wants to kill you and everything within a surrounding 500-meter radius. Just don't do it. They were trialled in the post-war period, and every single navy that trialled them dropped them, even the Russians. And if the Soviet Union drops something, then you know it's gotta be unreliable. I think I've got that right. All the major navies trialled hydrogen peroxide-powered submarines, and all of them dropped them. I think. Oh no, Kursk's, the torpedo that we think killed Kursk was one of those rocket torpedoes that could supercavitate.
No.
Wasn't it?
No. It was a hydrogen peroxide torpedo.
Oh, there you are then. Boom.
It was one of the very large diameter Waycomers.
And it blew up. That's just...
Yeah, gunnery officer, I did mention that.
Of course, it was abandoned as a concept. Although, its spiritual success...
It was generally, yeah, it was abandoned when Sea Sprite came in place of Sea Sprite, or for Sea Sprite. Which, just a smaller naval helicopter than what they had been fielding, and would eventually lead to Lamps 1. But Dash was a way of initially getting on the Fram cans a standoff torpedo employment method.
Remind me
That
again,
could
just
go farther than what they had at the time, because they didn't have the VLA at the time.
remind me again, just
Or not VLA, but ASRock at the time,
yeah.
the pepper box.
Yeah, remind me just for myself and the people in the audience who just to remind me, Framcans are the upgrades on the last generation of World War II American destroyers.
One of the upgrades, yes.
Good, just wanted to make sure I was in the right ballpark there. Last time we had a ramblings with you and me. We were talking a lot about NATO battle groups and other things. I wanted to actually, if it's all right, talk a little bit about Sweden, just a little bit, and what they've actually, because I've like, what have they actually brought to the alliance overall, apart from the, well, obviously very capable army, navy, and air force.
So, as it is now, they're already planning on contributing, it sounds like, a brigade. Long term, but initially a battalion to the Canadian-led battle group in the Baltic. One of the Baltic states, I believe it's Lithuania. They bring a rather capable Air Force. As much as people like to shit on the Gripen, it is still a capable light multi-role fighter. Kind of expensive for what it is, but it is still a capable light multi-role fighter.
And you can operate it out of a plowed field.
No, you can't.
No, I'm joking. I'm being facetious, but it's
Anywhere you can operate a Gripen, if you want to try hard enough, you can operate an F-35. Like, it's that aspect is way overblown. Yes. Like, the Air Force and Marines have already practiced doing this with F-35A and F-35B. Like,
Anna, I think that's what he means by try hard enough at it.
Like, you just got to be willing to deploy the assets you need, and you can literally do them out of a truck, or out of two trucks, because you're not just deploying a fighter, you're probably going to be deploying a force ship. So you can deploy a couple trucks with them for the maintenance personnel, stuff like that, the pop-up tent hangars, and you've got yourself a little airstrip in the middle of nowhere on this highway, right? Like, I mean, gunnery officer, adding RBS 15 to the mix in the Baltic Sea, like, yeah, great, that's awesome, but it doesn't change the balance. Like, the Baltic is a NATO lake and has been a NATO lake. People talking about how the Russians have this advantage in the Baltic don't know what the hell they're talking about.
I remember you telling me that the last time we did this, that the Baltic fleet of the Russian Navy exists to die in 48 hours. That the
Less. It exists under the guns of the Polish artillery.
What?
It is based in Kaliningrad, in Baltisk. It is well within. It is well within K9 Thunder range. It is way within Gimler's range.
I cast Russian Navy be gone.
St. Petersburg wouldn't be better. Like, it'd be just as bad.
It's literally only there.
It's not as a coastal battery gunnery officer. It, like, literally, it could be acting as a line brigade artillery, and they could be shelling Baltisk.
Problem is, in the case of war, the Kaliningrad's fleet, the fleet's home port is Kaliningrad.
Yeah, Baltisk is in Kaliningrad, and it's not even far from the border for Kaliningrad terms.
Sidious,
from where the Polish naval strike missile land-based battery is, the Russians will never see that coming either.
And St. Petersburg won't save them either, because the Finns have joined as well. So now the Finns.
Well, even without the Finns, you have Estonia right there.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Like, distance works both ways. And one side has dramatically more firepower than the other in this regard. Like it's not even close.
I mean, just to expand on topics that we've discussed before, we talked a lot about mass and, the use of just sheer mass in modern combat operations, how we're seeing the usage of numbers of men and materiel.
You're not seeing it correctly used in the Ukraine war.
Oh no, I'm not saying that it is. But it's more just the fact that NATO can't bring that to bear in the Baltic at this time.
That's not entirely true.
Oh, go on.
So if we compare the current balance of forces, NATO dramatically outweighs the Russians because the Russians are currently occupied in Ukraine. So as it stands currently, there's roughly a total brigade strength, not including the Baltic states' own militaries, which would bring this up to basically a full division per each of the 3 Baltic states. That's roughly a corps. It roughly all of that correlation of forces roughly falls under British command, or would fall under joint British-Danish corps command up there. It's like joint multinational corps northeast or something.
Because you did say entrusted to our command because we have experience operating in brigade strength. You said, I think, something like that.
Well, you guys are one of the few nations in corps level strength. You guys are one of the few nations that has maintained corps commands in NATO. The Poles bring 4 square divisions to the fight.
Nice.
So that's 16 brigades. Not including the forces they would mobilize as well.
The Poles do have the equipment for that mobilization? Given what they said.
It'd be mostly home guard type forces.
Fair enough. Just wanted to make sure what sort of forces we're talking about.
The Germans actually could bring around a corps if you incorporate the Dutch, which is the plan for the Dutch anyways. They could bring around a corps themselves to the fight. How effective it would be, I don't know, because the Heer is still digging itself out of a hole. The French are working back up to a corps. The Belgians basically just incorporate in with the French. The Brits would be providing an additional division, 3rd UK, / leading a corps. The Danes fold in with the Baltic force. The Swedes, the Norwegians, and the Finns basically handle with some British reinforcement from it. The British Light Division and the US handle the High North. Like, NATO can bring to bear a lot of forces. Fleet, I wouldn't make that assessment.
But it'll probably start conventional. At least.
Probably. I can't say that it would stay conventional, and I can't say that nuclear conflict is currently the least likely it has ever been. I do believe that statement in particular is just straight up false.
I will yield to your better judgment then. You know more than I do. That's not me being snarky, that's me being genuinely serious. Cyclic knows more than I do, so take his word over mine.
It may stay conventional, it may not. That really depends how the war goes.
Basically, because... Okay, now I know that I'm wrong, but the reason that I made that assessment a couple of minutes ago is that the Kremlin gains very little from escalation to nuclear conflict. In fact, it gains virtually nothing. In fact, they gain more from the threat of escalation than they do from actual escalation. In the case of a Russo-NATO conflict. It benefits the Kremlin to leave that last box open, but never take the option. Because in the case of a NATO-Russian nuclear slugging match, NATO will win. Europe will be very badly damaged, and the US will be slightly bruised. But
That's not correct at all.
But Russia will just be fucking gone.
I don't know where you're getting the assessment that the US will be very slightly bruised, or that Europe will be very damaged but still functional. That's not the case at all. The US and Russia are the only nations capable of conducting multi-level strategic nuclear warfare. Still. Both are.
There will not be any winner to a nuclear war. That's not true.
That's not true either. Would the US likely win and be able to rebuild itself? Yes. Would Russia likely be gone? Well, not gone, but no longer a intact nation state able to govern itself? Almost certainly. Would Russia be, or would Europe be a cohesive political entity or collection of political cohesive entities? No. Fair. That's not how the U.S. at this point would be conducting a strategic nuclear exchange. Certainly not in the opening stages, and probably not in the follow-up either.
I will direct you to a previous ramblings that we did, because I don't want to go over the same topic again, because we did actually discuss.
The British and French gunnery officer do not have enough warheads for that.
If you'll give me a second.
You might see St. Petersburg, Moscow, and one more city dramatically hit.
Yeah, I will direct you to Fleet's Random Ramblings 22, the one ironically called Short But Sweet that lasted for 4 bloody hours, where we talked at length about a hypothetical...
The bulk of the French warheads there are not strategic level and would not be meaningfully employable in this scenario.
Yeah, now I want to ask you something. In the terms of raw strategic potential, if one side is existing and the other side is not, that's a victory.
Depends on how you want to judge victory. So Thayer, it's because ASMP has to be fired off of a Rafale, and a Rafale can only carry one. Their air force isn't that big.
They have no silos. France decommissioned their land-based nuclear weapons.
They have their SSBNs and ASMP.
Yes.
Just like the Brits only have the one SSBN they keep out at sea available in the event of an exchange. And that assumes that it would actually be able to launch.
Yeah. Submarine Spitfire, it wouldn't even be a 99% casualty rate, especially not with modern atomic weapons.
Again, it depends on what is targeted, what attack plan is gone with for every actor here. Like, you can't speak in these sorts of generalities. It's not how this works.
Yeah, I'm going to point out, I'm going to move us on from this to a different topic. And again, if you want a more in-depth discussion on this, we did at least a good hour-and-a-half discussion on nuclear warfare in Fleet's Random Ramblings 22 on the YouTube channel. So go and have a look at that, so it saves us having to repeat ourselves. So, moving back to I'd like to dive into the Swedish equipment, if that's just to bring us back off nuclear discussions. So I think the Swedes operate a version of Leopard 2 that they build domestically. I think is their MBT. I think.
Yes, they have a couple different versions, sort of based off of the 2A5, 2A6 that they have gone and done their own improvements to. Their newest version is effectively a dramatically up-armored equivalent to the 2A7, with some quite extensive overhead protection.
Yep, CV90 is running around.
Yeah, they're so. In terms of how their formations kind of operate, I'm gonna sort of direct you to Brendan's video, so Battle Order. He's got a video on how they sort of task organize. But they're an interesting force. They have a primary emphasis on the infantry remaining mounted during the fight rather than dismounting to fight.
That's interesting.
They're not the only ones who do this. The Russians had this emphasis as well. Now, don't use that to, undermine this too much, because the Russians didn't even have their full TONE of infantry when this thing kicked off, or even their full rosters. So, it's not even logistics there. So keep in mind, at the start of this conflict, a standard Russian contract soldier, right? So somebody who, they're not a conscript. They are doing this as their job. They are near enough equivalent to, U.S. enlisted, right? They can refuse a deployment. Like, legally, it is well within their right. Unless there is an act. This has changed since, but at the start of this, they could refuse to say, they could just straight up refuse to go to Ukraine. And most of the infantry guys did. Yes, however, most of them refused to partake in the exercise. Because they didn't have to. Because the exercise was broadly supposed to be taking them to Belarus. Outside the borders of Russia. They were entirely within their right to go, no, I'd rather spend the winter at home with my family. So
it wasn't the Kontraki going into Ukraine with that exercise, it was the...
No, they were. It was which ones went. It was the ones that went. And so on top of units being under strength, because the Russians placed an emphasis on the number of brigades that they wanted, without truly looking at how able they were to fill things out. This is something that the U.S. Army is currently having a problem with. Because of that emphasis, they already had brigades that were undermanned in a force designed around a tiered mobilization concept. So the contract Niki would be able to fill out one BTG nominally out of the brigade's equipment set. Okay, so BTG is a battalion tactical group. It's very similar to the U.S. concept of a battalion task force or a German Kampfgruppe or British battle group, right? So, it's it's sort of a task organized around a parent battalion, be that tank, be that infantry, whatever, right? Some units saw the writing on the wall, Thayer. So, like the Assault Corps and Combined Arms Army that were down in Crimea, right? They were ready, which is one of the reasons why they were able to. Straight up, they nearly got to Melito. What is it?
I used to know this.
Mykolaiv, before the Ukrainians got that bridge wired. Had the Ukrainians not gotten that bridge wired in time, we would have seen a Russian amphibious landing to secure another bridge farther along the coast road to help open up the path towards Odessa. We might have even seen an actual VDV landing near Odessa as well to assist with the assault on the city. No. Kherson had its whole set of issues, but the Russian troops didn't cross at Kherson. They crossed north of Kherson, along the dam that now no longer exists.
Oh yeah, that.
Because they knew the Ukrainians wouldn't blow it because of what it would do to Kherson. There used to be a naval yard in Russian it's Nikolaev, in Ukrainian it's Mykolaiv. So I don't remember the name of the town on the coast, but there was a planned, I believe, 2 naval infantry BTG landing on the coast farther west of Mykolaiv. That they actually had to pull back once they realized that the ground forces launching out of Crimea were not going to be able to get to them, because 2 battalions, not a viable landing force to carry that attack. There was a Ukrainian tank brigade forming up around Odessa, a reserve one, but that's still a tank brigade against largely BTR equipped infantry battalions. It's not going to go well.
Last time I checked, 14.5mm machine guns can't penetrate.
These were 30 mil, but
still. Yeah, the point still.
And they would have had 2 companies of T-72B3Ms, because the naval infantry were actually properly equipped, because they were, like the VDV, considered an elite rapid response force. And the naval infantry did prove themselves fighting in Mariupol, taking horrendous casualties, but largely taking the city. No. So what happened with that river crossing is there's actually an account from a Ukrainian engineering officer involved in smashing that. The Ukrainians had paid a lot of attention to the possibility of an attack to seize the rest of the Donbass. Okay, that's what they were anticipating with this attack. And as a result, Ukrainian bridging engineers, river assault engineers had done years of river reconnaissance. So they knew where the Russians were likely to cross. They had it under observation. And, well, you have a crossing point under observation, and you're going to smash it with artillery. That's what happened. The Ukrainians smashed it with artillery. They did lose some Su-25s hitting it as well with a large amount of cluster bombs. So that bridge crossing ran into, like so many assaults in this war, a lack of appropriately done fires for support, both to suppress enemy ability to bring fires to bear on you, as well as suppress enemy observation and fighting positions. I've said this a couple times on this podcast, but when you look at the Ukrainian attempt to push through the Surovikin line, there's a reason it failed. The Ukrainians did not concentrate enough force and enough firepower onto a narrow enough front.
Is that failure understandable, or could they have done it and just didn't?
They should not have attacked then. At least not into the heaviest defenses on the front, into a position where an entire Russian combined arms army had pretty much been left alone to train and prepare to defend and build those defenses. They should never have attacked in the south.
So they literally picked the worst place to launch a counteroffensive.
And they weren't prepared to launch a counteroffensive, if I'm honest. And they had telegraphed that they were coming down there.
Why the heck did they launch a counteroffensive then?
Because politically they needed to.
Okay.
They had to launch an attack. And remember, hang on. You have 3 of the largest concentrations of people still under Russian occupation at the time in that area. You have Mariupol, Melitopol, and Tokmak.
So militarily it was unwise, but politically they didn't really have a choice.
Yeah. The best option would have been to try to attack in the north. But so Supermarine, if that's the objective, that's where they had to attack.
Problem is they weren't ready. And the Ukrainian general staff, I think, knew they weren't ready?
I'm not sure. So they broadly brought in about 6 brigades for this attack, in addition to the forces that were already there, which that's another 2 to 3. That sounds like a lot of force, right?
Not for an attack against a fortified position.
Well, so let's take a step back to 1991. 7 Corps, right? Allied 7th Corps. You know, the big left hook, right, of the coalition.
Yep.
In their attack into Iraq, they had to go through an Iraqi mechanized infantry division. Dug in.
Yes.
The U.S. had air supremacy.
Yes, they did.
But irrespective of that air supremacy, right? 14,000 rounds of 105 and 203 millimeter artillery were fired in an afternoon in support of that attack. That's not including the rest of the 22 artillery battalions that were firing MLRS, which at this time is DPICM.
Bloody hell.
Okay. So all in all, there were 22 artillery battalions focused in on this attack. This does not include the battalion 120 mil mortars that also got thrown in. This does not include the Apache attack helicopters thrown in, or the British ATGM Lynxes. Okay. 7 Corps had 4 divisions as part of it. That is 12 brigades plus an additional armored cavalry regiment. So about a brigade size there. All of this was focused on supporting one division, so 3 brigades, focused in on a combined arms breach against an Iraqi mechanized infantry division. Right? So the Ukrainians here were broadly attacking in a couple different spots with single brigades to try to create breaches. But here's the problem. The Ukrainians couldn't even focus the entire brigade. They did not have the staffs.
God damn it.
They couldn't. In a lot of cases, what we were seeing were company teams, company tactical groups, as they call them, and the Russians call them, trying to do these breaching operations. They had no business using companies to do that.
That's not gonna work. You're just asking yourself to get artillery to death, and even if you somehow don't,
It wasn't the artillery that caused the problems.
I mean, I was gonna say,
Entire companies got smashed by Russian attack helicopters.
yeah, this is what I was gonna say. Even if you somehow don't get artillery, you've got the attack helos dealing with you, and if the attack helos don't show up, you've somehow got to take a company against a very well entrenched position held by fresh troops.
When you don't have enough fires,
Yeah, when you don't have fires.
you can't. Their smoke missions were poor. They were poorly coordinated. Their regular HE was poorly coordinated, right? This myth that Ukraine is basically a NATO army is bullshit.
It's not. Like, Christ almighty.
Um,
I'm sick of
They never were,
Even I know.
and this is something I have been consistent on.
I mean, cycling, you know that I'm not an expert on this shit, but even I understood that Ukraine was not a NATO army.
Ukraine is still very much a post-Soviet army. So no, Thayer, it didn't start out that way. It started out as, oh, they're winning because they're like us. They fight like a NATO army.
Which I think is a disservice to the Ukrainian army, to be blunt.
The reason they won in the early phase of the war was because the Russians weren't going in prepared. They weren't going in with a sound battle plan. At this point, probably Thayer. But so 3rd Assault Brigade is the old Azov unit, Supermarine. You'll notice they got sent into the Bakhmut meat grinder. They got sent in to cover the retreat out of Avdiivka. There's a trend. There's a reason for it.
Well, there's a question for you, if you can answer it. What went wrong in Kharkiv? Like, why? Like, basically, you know, the biggest...
The Russians didn't bring enough infantry.
Wow, that's really simple.
They also rushed in march order, not in combat order, and they entirely prioritized speed over security. And that's not on the Russian army. They were ordered to advance that way. There's been more than enough information that the Russian army objected to this, but was told to do it anyways. This plan came out of the FSB and the Kremlin. Had the Russian objectives been a conventional ground offensive to end the war in eastern Ukraine on their terms, they would have been able to easily do it. But their objectives were the seizure of all of Ukraine, a decapitation of their political leadership in Kyiv, under the belief that if they pull that off, the whole thing will come down like Crimea did. They almost did it, too.
The problem we've got now, and that I think people need to realise, is that this war is basically going to drag on, and on, and on, and on, and on.
Not necessarily.
Oh.
So the Russians are going to be coming to a very, very, very heavy brick wall in 2025, 2026, in that time frame. that brick wall is they can't produce enough artillery barrels. They can't produce enough artillery. And they are running desperately low on their stocks. They are pretty much running out of reasonable tanks that are relatively modern to convert. Um, they are running into serious problems. They are pretty much run through most of the late 80s Soviet stocks. The Ukrainians, though, need to get through this year. This is sort of their 1942. Ghost, it's not T-80 plus variants. It's, for the Russians, it's T-72s predominantly.
And that's if you're lucky.
No, it's not if you're lucky. Right now, those are still the overwhelming majority of tanks in the Russian ground forces in Ukraine, along with T-90Ms.
They are actually building
As the second less. Those are the only versions of T-90s they're building, and those are generally being new. Those are generally new builds.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, we know Ukraine needs really more of everything. We know.
So. Bishtron, there's a problem with the artillery shells they're getting from North Korea. The driving bands aren't in spec. And because of that, they clog up the rifling on the guns. And then, once they do that, they start shrinking the diameter of the barrel. And they do this pretty rapidly. It's generally going to be within the first 200 to 300 rounds. Means your guns blow up.
It's also probably viable that the Chinese and North Koreans aren't sending their best rounds to Russia.
Oh, the North Koreans are 100% doing what they did to the Iranians. They're sending the factory rejects. It's what the North Koreans do.
And honestly, it's funny.
It's not RIP artillery barrel gunnery officer. It's RIP crew, because that gun is going to detonate. The Russians themselves are already running out of artillery. Like the guns.
Sidious asks about manpower. He said he's read that the Russian state has a problem that the armed forces and the industry are fighting between who gets limited manpower. Is there any truth to that?
That's a Perun narrative. To an extent, for certain skilled manpower, yes. The reality of the situation is the Russians have yet to fully mobilize.
Yeah, that's apparent.
They're likely heading towards another mobilization wave.
I mean, I had expected to fully mobilize and use the attack that happened recently.
Well, they've just blamed the Ukrainians for it yesterday or a couple days ago, like formally, and demanded stuff from the Ukrainians, which is so dumb, and it's obviously just wrong. But so we'll see how that goes. Gunnery officer, what was true at the start of this war is no longer a truth at the right now. So platitudes like that just don't apply anymore. The Russian army has a ton of combat experience junior leaders. A ton of them. It's going to be interesting to see how the Russian army rebuilds post-war.
What do you mean by that?
They're going to be changing. They always do after a war like this. They sit down and they study it and they adjust. Historically, that's how they do things. They're already showing that they're learning. The Russians are already showing that they are now, again, capable of doing brigade and division actions. It's how they took Avdiivka. It's how they popped the flanks.
No, saying failed upwards is actually missing the point. The people who survived are the smart ones. They haven't failed upwards, they've succeeded in learning. They are dangerous. Do not underestimate people who've survived in a conflict like this.
So, Sidious, for the glide bomb threat, yeah, the solution is far more medium-range air defense, which the West does not have the capability to give them. Yeah.
No, Turbines, you can't. Funny joke, though. Russia needs to pull out from the country. Yes, that is correct. They will not, however, until they're forced to.
It's going to be very helpful for them. It's going to help with the general air defense of the country, and dramatically increase their ability to conduct precision strikes, because an F-16 is handedly better at using JDAMs and other Western precision munitions than MiG-29s are. KB, that's actually not the case. It's because the West has, since 1990, gotten rid of its divisional 30 to 40 kilometer air defense that's mobile. Like, it has non-mobile ones, but not stuff that can keep up with ground forces. Yes, F-16s could be modified for Scalp, etc., Taurus, etc.
Which would take pressure off the Ukrainian Su-24 fleet.
The biggest thing, though, is Slammer.
Oh, yes. Slammer.
Slammer, while it is generally derided in U.S. Navy circles, Thayer, that would be a really bad idea. It would not survive very long.
The Russians would have a field day blowing that up. They would probably send a few ballistic missiles to blow that up.
It would take more than a few, but like it would just be a target. Like, so Tirpitz, you don't really win the fight against glide bombs by engaging the glide bombs. You have to push the Archer back out of glide bomb range from the target you wish to defend. But where Slammer comes in handy is it's already being replaced in the U.S. inventory, like wildly replaced. It's effectively just not in the inventory anymore because it's been JASM'd out of existence. However, it's got some very nice capabilities for the Ukrainians, largely around that imaging seeker. It allows it to operate in a GPS-denied environment, either man-in-the-loop or not. Slammer is not really a modified harpoon. It's a whole new missile.
I love the way Slammer looks.
Slam is a modified harpoon.
I love the way Slammer looks, can I just say? It looks really menacing and cool. Like with the bow.
That is not a medium-range missile, Ghost. That is CAM.
That's short range.
That's inside 30 kilometer. Iris TSLM or Iris TSLS. One of the Iris Ts has a medium range capability, but it's not the one that really can be a truly mobile, keep up with ground troops system. None of these Western systems in existence are.
Battery of some things with a radar vehicle that can move, deploy within like a minute, track a target, fire.
What Ukraine needs is far more Bukem too.
Yes.
But there's no more to give them.
It's not Yeah, as Cyclic says, it's not just about the range band, it's about the ability to be mobile within that ability to engage.
Truck mounted does you no good if you have to protect a target, i.e. ground maneuver forces, that aren't traveling along roads, because the roads are mined via artillery fire, or are just all slop anyways because so many tanks have driven over them.
Well, no.
Generally, Russian AA systems are halfway decent. It's the operators that tend to be the problem because they're not all that operator friendly.
The automatic is not a medium range AA system. The automatic is, I believe, entirely too much gun.
The radar systems are an integral part of them. There. When used correctly, they are an absolute pain in the ass to deal with. See Serbia in the 90s. Absolutely humiliating NATO. Like, yeah, we pushed through it en masse, but it was really embarrassing. I suspect not on JASM's gunnery officer. The U.S. doesn't have enough as is, because remember, the U.S.'s numbers on JASM are driven by the China question. The U.S. can't afford to give away JASMs. Slammer, however, yes. Increasing production takes time, and we're bringing a second factory online. It still takes time, and in the current employment market in the U.S., there are dramatically more jobs than there are workers across the board in basically every industry. It takes time, and you got to find people to hire. There's a reason the Constellation program got delayed a year. Fincantieri can't hire enough welders. Hawks are already going to Ukraine. There are some very interesting kit batches of Hawk and Soviet systems that I have been told are a thing, but I have not seen images of. Also, Patriot and some Russian systems, or Soviet systems. So, HARM's already being used, gunnery officer. It's already being sent. They're employing it off of flankers and fulcrums, so MiG-29 or Su-27s and MiG-29s. Maverick doesn't really make sense for this kind of a conflict. Not anymore. And yes, basic Hawk batteries are already being used. But again, a Hawk battery doesn't fill the same role as Buk. I mean, it does for a static site, but not for a mobile force. Depends on the IRST system, Sidious. Some of them are short range. One of them, actually, most of them are short range. One of them is medium range. That's an interesting concept there, Fluff. Wonder where I've heard that one before. It's not just with Kub.
Oh, God.
Oh. Buk Seahawk has already, or not Buk Seahawk, Buk Sea Sparrow has already been confirmed, Phoenix.
Oh, God.
As part of Frank and Sam. So, and what I will say is it's really funny when you look at the guidance channel for a Hawk missile and what the director for Buk is able to talk in terms of its guidance channels. There's a really interesting overlap there.
You're implying something, aren't you?
I'm not implying anything. I'm just stating a fact. Like, they literally are in the same frequency band. And Buk, so Hawk, so if you look at those missiles for Kub there, right? Hawk is slightly smaller in terms of diameter with the fins. And Buks are capable of firing Kub missiles. No, those are Buk interceptors. Those are not ESSMs. Those are way too large to be ESSM. Although the funny part is ESSM gets basically the same performance, actually slightly better, than those missiles there. That's Buk M2. No, I don't there. Moskva... The Soviets retired the Slavas for a reason. And Moskva herself was slated to be retired by the Black Sea Fleet very quickly. They just couldn't because of politics. The city of Moscow paid for her to be reactivated. The other thing is, even if she was fully operational, she wouldn't have been capable of engaging those Neptunes. She never should have been operating by herself. The Black Sea Fleet never had the correlation of forces it needed if Ukraine put up resistance.
The Black Sea Fleet has just been taking loss after loss for literally nothing to show for it. Even their attempt at a blockade failed miserably.
They just weren't prepared for this conflict, and they can't bring in any more forces.
Because Turkey has said no.
Turkey said no to any warships passing through, which is their right under the treaty.
That's correct.
What the Russians should have done is those two Slava-based groups that they brought in to the Mediterranean, those should have gone into the Black Sea Fleet ahead of this conflict. Along with the Grigorovich from the Black Sea Fleet that is currently sitting in Tartus with its thumb up its ass, unable to do anything to contribute to the war effort. Because between those two fleets, or those two task groups, you would have had an Udaloy, which can provide excellent short-range defense of another asset with its Tor. Two more Grigos, and a full Grigorovich, plus two Slavas, one of whom's been fully modernized and another partially modernized.
The Russian Navy in the Black Sea has given a very poor showing.
The Black Sea Fleet is the red-headed stepchild of the Russian Navy, which itself is the red-headed stepchild of the MOD.
Basically.
Now, it could be worse. It could be the Black Sea Fleet's red-headed stepchild, the Baltic Fleet. But this conflict provides no indication of how the Northern Fleet would fight or the Pacific Fleet. None.
If I see one more Russian
outside of the fact that they can competently fire VLS.
Yeah. If I see one more video saying Russian fleet's terrible, I'm going to shoot the person making it.
Well, don't make threats you can't carry out.
Funny. Haha. I was being figurative. But still, the Russian Navy has had precisely 2 periods of terrible showings. That was the 2nd Pacific Squadron during the Russo-Japanese War, and the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. At every other point prior to that, the Russian fleet and the Soviet fleet has given a fairly decent account of itself. You're forgetting I'm not. The period during the Soviet Union was a fairly competent and effective Russian fleet.
The Soviet Navy was not stupid.
Even during the Soviet fleet's worst period, aka immediately after its formation, they still managed to get a dreadnought battleship running and sail it out to engage the British Expeditionary Force in the Baltic. A navy that isn't competent would not have been able to do that with limited spare parts and limited crews.
You know, this is, excuse me.
The narrative of Russian naval incompetence is a woozle that has been chasing its own tail, relying on the myths of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, and it has been reinvigorated by Russian performance in the Black Sea.
You have to remember that they are still one of the big three. And when it comes to throw weight of weaponry, there's really only one navy that can challenge them truly.
Well, the Whiskey on the Rocks was an unfortunate event. And the Moskvas were...
There, I'd like to point out the Jimmy Carter running full speed into a seamount.
Once a day, give yourself a present.
Anecdotes are anecdotes.
Don't wait for it,
They
just
happen to every fleet.
let it happen.
And the best part is that seamount was on the chart they had.
Beer or 2 cups of good, hot, black
Oh, the Chinese can take on the Russian fleet right now.
like Christmas.
Yes and no. It wildly depends. The Chinese versus the Russian Pacific Fleet, sure. You start throwing the aggregate of the Russian fleet in there, the Chinese are going to have some problems. Yeah, not Jimmy Carter, Connecticut. Sorry, Phoenix.
I mean, the Russians have managed to get Kuznetsov running in a semi-competent state again, just this year, or was it the end of
Well,
last year?
she's not running yet, but what I will say here is if there is one branch that has had me blinking and going, what, of the Russian military, it's their Air Force.
I'll agree with you on that one.
Now, I fully understand why they have all sorts of issues. They don't have a large number of tankers. They don't have a dedicated aggressor force to train against. They don't have a large number of AWACS.
They have even less.
So while most of their fighters are capable, technically as a design, of mid-air refueling, their pilots are not trained for it, and they don't have enough tankers really to do strike packages to begin with. And if you cannot do strike packages, this is a lesson for every NATO Air Force, by the way, outside of the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps. If you cannot do strike packages, you cannot show up to play in a modern war. Without the ability to conduct strike packages, you might as well be on the defense only. And you don't win a war by defending.
Why would you want to bring the Kuznetsov into service? It is an aircraft carrier that can...
Thayer, the Russians need the ability to keep things like P-8s, P-3s away from their formations. The other thing to keep in mind with Kuznetsov is those Su-33s can carry KH-35s and 31s off of that deck. They provide some striking capability. They also provide the ability to help disrupt airstrikes coming in.
There is also no replacement for Kuznetsov, and likely won't be one for some time. The Russians can afford Kuznetsov. And
That's part of the refit they just did to her, Thayer.
They literally sold...
They ripped those boilers out and put new ones in.
This is again part of the whole myth. Again, this whole thing with Kuznetsov is she gets beaten with a stick, and I am sick of it. Because it's just not true.
Like, is she a great aircraft carrier? Absolutely not.
Is she better than nothing?
She is still useful. She, how do I put this? Provides a better maritime strike capability than the Queen Elizabeths do currently.
That's true.
Combined.
I can't deny that. He's right.
That is, unless you put U.S. Marine Corps F-35s on there with their munitions.
Yeah,
But
motorcycling. Thank you very
Um,
Do you think they're actually new boilers? Yes, I
Yes.
have no reason to doubt that fact.
they're very clearly new boilers. We saw them getting craned in. Used boilers don't look like that.
Yet also, Man of Fluff, she's been in dock for quite some time. It would also require not corrupt... Fuck's sake, not this stupid fucking myth of fucking corruption. The...
Corruption is a thing. Corruption, however, doesn't change what you can see with your own eyes.
Also, what would be the corruption benefit in stealing naval oil-fired boilers? I genuinely can't see.
We also literally watched them get put in on video into the ship.
Yeah. No, you can't theoretically install nuclear power plants on the Kuznetsov. She's not built for it. And that would cause more problems. An oil-fired... With these new boilers, she'll be back to how she was when she was built. A reliable, easy to fuel, easy to operate, conventional carrier. The Russians can run.
I won't say reliable. She's got other issues, but she's gonna be reliable enough.
That's what I was driving at. I should have really said for a given value reliable.
And if they're smart, they'll replace the flanker Ds with MiG-29Ks. If they're smart.
It does not rely on a fuck's sake. Am I gonna have to start slapping people about? I am sick of these bloody...
Drac rooms. Cut the crap. Seriously. Like, I'm just gonna break off for a second here. The QEs have both ruptured their shafts. Okay? Cut the crap. We've had a Nimitz-class carrier suffer a full ship power failure that rendered her inhospitable to human life. Cut the crap.
Yeah, the QEs have problems.
The reasoning is quite simply the Flanker D is too large of an aircraft for the Kuznetsov. It's also too large for its own engines. The Russians don't have Motor Siege anymore. Motor Siege is in Ukraine. Currently under fire from Russian long-range precision fires.
That's very true. Turfits, I don't know what the current state of modern Russian warship construction is. I don't know. I'm not an expert.
Realistically, you're looking at the Gorshkovs as the best they can produce, and the Gorshkovs are
they gas
not something I'd want to be dealing with in a European Navy.
Are they gas turbine driven or are they steam turbine?
Depends. It's a mix of gas turbine and diesel. So we'll see where they go from here. They lost some of the turbochargers they needed for the diesels with the sanctions relating to the 2022 invasion. The fun thing about that is you can always still get them.
Yeah.
You might have to change what kind of turbocharger you're using, but you can always still get a turbocharger.
Why did the Russians opt with ski jump instead of Katabar? They had no experience with Katabar ski jumps.
No, it came down to political.
Really?
The same guy that caused all sorts of problems in preventing the Soviet Navy from becoming a true carrier navy, despite its intentions. This guy was up in the echelons, well above Navy. I think the Soviets still called it the Ministry of Defense. He was on the sort of defense industrial side. He made all the decisions for that.
Oh, God. You're telling me that...
Deeply opposed carriers, viewed them as not Soviet. The Navy desperately wanted Catobar carriers. Going back into the 60s, they wanted them, and they wanted big ones. They're like they were trying to pursue a navalized MiG-23, which gonna sound really horrible, but when you look at the time frame of that, this is a contemporary to the F4 Phantom. The MiG-23 is not bad as a contemporary to the F4 Phantom. Okay, and a navalized, it's a swing wing. It would actually work quite well for the low speed performance needed for landing and takeoff.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And the 23 has very robust landing gear for what it is. So it wasn't that they couldn't get Catobar to work, it's that they were literally prohibited as a navy by individuals higher up in government from going with Catobar. So they had to look for workarounds. Their first workarounds were the Kievs. That at least got them with Yak 38 an ability to push maritime patrol aircraft away, whether that's S3 Vikings, whether that's P3s, away from their surface groups, while also providing them a ship that can carry a lot of helicopters and support them, as well as support its own task group.
Damn. I had no idea they were hamstrung that bad. Well, you know.
And then after that, that's when they started pursuing carriers and started working towards it. They were on course, if the Soviet Union lasted longer, to actually going Catobar. Largely because dude died. Or was very shortly going to be forced into retirement at his Dasha. I don't remember which, because he was going senile. But so
the Black Sea Fleet. Do you think Black Sea Fleet will be short a couple more ships before this war ends?
depends, because here's the thing, Sidious, with Russia's interior lines of communication with rivers and canals, they can bring corvettes in and out of the Black Sea Fleet at will, even from the Baltic Fleet or the Northern Fleet. So keep that in mind. Yes, Oriel was a thing. So was Ulyanovsk. There were a couple different things with Yuli, including one that's sort of this hybrid Stobar Catobar thing, so they could get basically an E2 ski. I wish we had a good one like that for the Chinese, but sort of term like we do with putting ski on everything, like harpoon ski for KH-35, but we don't. So, you know, they were looking at adding that. They were looking at potentially, with a larger carrier, doing some other things to ease their way in. Oriole was a sort of 70s sort of deal. Got blocked pretty heavily by said individual whose name I don't remember. But the Soviet Navy wanted carriers. They wanted to be able to truly contest north of the GIUK gap. They weren't all that interested in pushing down south of the GIUK gap, but they wanted to be able to contest the Greenland and the Norwegian seas. And they planned to do that during a major naval, if the Cold War went hot. They planned on trying to contest those areas. And it would have been a fight before NATO was able to really push north and get into the Barents and go after the
Boomers.
well, not necessarily the boomers, but get after the home base of the Russian fleet. Being able to threaten those bastions was the goal. Not necessarily to target what's in them, but be able to put pressure on those bastions. KB, I don't know, because that to me is a ridiculous question. So I don't know the answer to that. And it sounds like you think it's a ridiculous question as well.
I think it was more hypothetical, rhetorical, as in, you know, it's just Roscosmos is not going to make an attempt on the moon. They couldn't get there at the height of Cold War funding when the N1s blew up multiple times. I mean, they could have done if the N1s hadn't, well, suffered.
It's the Chinese I'd be concerned about. Not Roscosmos.
Basically because they didn't think that Ukraine was going to resist.
They didn't think so the Russian National Command Authority, i.e. Putin and his immediate set of leaders around him, did not believe that this war was going to last past 15 days at the worst. They thought this was going to be a Crimea 2014 repeat. That was where the Russians went wrong. And if they thought that Ukraine was going to put up a serious fight, they wouldn't have gone for something this risky.
The Turks closed the Bosporus. No warships from anyone's fleet in or out. Not NATO.
NATO can't even move ships in.
The only warships that can go through those straits now are those flying the Turkish flag.
Yep.
Merchant traffic is unrestricted, however. It was actually a genius. Well, it wasn't a genius move, but it was the correct move by the Ottoman. Turkey is not the Ottoman state. The Ottoman state died in 1919, I think, when Ataturk declared it illegitimate after it continued to kowtow to the occupying Allied powers. And Ataturk declared, the foundation of the Turkish Republic to replace it.
Sidious, pretty much, unless they start moving in some of their smaller corvettes that are armed with fairly reasonable ship self-defense systems. Yes. Part of the problem they are having with these Ukrainian drones, like surface drones, literally comes down to their tactics and their deployment patterns. We'll see if those change. The Russians often times have to go through a lot of pain to learn. So we'll see. But keep in mind, they can fire calibers from the pier side. Like, Caliber is a hilariously long-range missile. If they really want to, they could have the Northern Fleet firing calibers from the White Sea.
How hard is it?
They can have the Caspian Sea flotilla fire them too.
How hard is it to detect such a naval drone? It depends on the naval drone.
Well, broadly speaking, they're the same size as the target ribs the US Navy and a bunch of Western navies use to simulate inbound suicide surface craft. So, and the reason for that is they have to carry a 250 to 500 pound bomb in the nose of them to have any effect. Also, chat, can we congratulate Phoenix for his successful April Fool's joke he's pulled on some people?
Oh, what did he pull?
I'll let Phoenix say in chat.
Please, I would love to hear this. It's got to be better than mine.
Caliber does have a longer range than Tomahawk. Not that this really matters. Because you're not, like, it's just not how these systems work, and not a meaningful distinction. So that is not the current generation of drone being used, Turpits. The smaller ones have largely been ineffective at sinking even minesweepers. No, that cruiser is like 99% structural rust and not useful for anything.
Any attempt to even move her would probably result in very dangerous.
In her just
actions.
falling apart.
There's... Oh. Oh, Phoenix, well done. Well done. Well done. Congratulations.
Photographed by a Canberra.
You know, oh yeah.
People ask for sources.
Well done. Well done. Oh yeah, the caterpillar stealth one was a good joke as well.
Though the funny thing is, there currently is a DARPA project going along those lines. So it's not as much of a joke as you would think.
Yeah, Hood. The only thing I did is I basically announced Ramblings was over. Turns out nobody believed that. Shame.
Turpits, they're not very effective things unless the navy that they're engaging has not kept up with the times. And the reason I say that is the Russians kind of have never considered small suicide attack craft much of a threat because they haven't really been operating in and around the Middle East.
Go watch
So,
October.
ignoring the dramatic NAV-C music they put on here, these target drones are about the same size as the drones the Ukrainian Navy is currently using. Keep in mind, this is ignoring the guided 57mm anti-surface round that has been in procurement basically just as the standard ammunition for the 57mm gun by the U.S. Navy since 2016. So for 8 years.
So the standard ammunition for the 57mm gun in U.S. Navy service is guided?
Yes. Capable of doing counter-drone, both surface and air.
That is a hilarious way to just say fuck you to the whole concept of drone attacks on U.S. warships.
Yes, Alamo.
Phoenix 0 out of 10 didn't last as long as Samuel B. Roberts did. Oh dear. I don't think militaries will be studying the war in Ukraine for decades. I think it's
There will be useful parts of it that get brought up and studied, but
it's important to bear in mind it's not a peer-on-peer conflict. It's a...
Is it? Would you say? Yeah. Both have different strengths and different weaknesses, but Ukraine, maybe not a true peer, but Ukraine is definitely a near peer to Russia. Remember, they were the second largest land army in Europe. Pre them mobilizing. Ukraine, yeah, the lessons from this war are you need to be able to fight at the divisional level and above. Okay? You need to be able to conduct massed airstrikes. You need to be able to use strike packages. You need to do all these things that we knew were a thing prior to the 90s peace dividends in the West, right? We knew all of this. If you listen to anyone who studied military history, they would tell you this, right? The Falklands didn't have too great of lessons other than, hey, sea skimmers are a threat, yo. Yeah, like, that statement right there that Phoenix is paraphrasing from a U.S. Army artillery officer, okay,
That
is
a great way to put it.
information age warfare is still industrial warfare. Every tenet of industrial warfare still applies.
Oh, the Ukrainian-Russian war is peer-to-peer. It's not asymmetric, it's peer-to-peer. They are sat there in battle lines fighting each other. They aren't using guerrilla warfare, they aren't using... there is some...
It's a full-on conventional war, Turpitz.
Which I think perhaps we should... I'm not saying you should be glad for a war breaking out, but it's been the impetus to finally shake off the last of the peace dividend from...
In most countries.
Oh no,
There are still European countries cutting defense spending.
Which ones? Oh wait. Oh,
The UK.
Yeah.
No, AAMC, it's not. This is not the Western Front or even the Eastern Front in World War I at all. This has far more analogs in World War II. Okay. The assaults, the fighting, still rely on mechanized mobility. No, Bakhmut wasn't. The bulk of fighting in Bakhmut, AAMC, was on the flanks, and it was mechanized. It was just done at company-level engagements. The reason you are seeing defense winning out is because neither side could really muster for much of this war the command ability to command above company-level assaults past the first 2 months of this war. The big change from that was when roughly a combined arms army amount of troops, so think of it as a lean Western corps, right, went on the attack around Avdiivka and busted open Ukrainian lines that had held since 2014. Well, 2015. Had held since 2015, okay? Forced their ways through. They took a lot of casualties. The only thing that stopped that was Ukrainian use of DPICM. Largely because the Russians still have not learned to spread out sufficiently when on the attack. They still maneuver largely in column through areas that aren't covered by mines. They still tie themselves to roads. That will change. Because Russia is still learning. And Russia is very very top down in how it learns rather than bottom up. Ukraine is very bottom up but has trouble scaling those lessons. DPICM is a vital munition for how NATO plans to conduct war. Regardless of what most of Western Europe says, their war plans depend on US use of DPICM in a large-scale conventional conflict. DPICM is too useful for dealing with breakthroughs, suppressing enemy assembly areas, conducting counter battery fire. Way too useful.
So, question, if I may. When Russia runs into this brick wall that they're going to run into in terms of supply and logistics,
Their offensive and defensive capacity will be greatly reduced, and they'll have to choose where on the front they want to prioritize. Because they will be heavily restricted by what they are able to produce. It's not like they will run clean out of supplies, right?
well, yeah,
They still have
I
that
figured as much.
throughput. They're going to have to ration and choose. Depends. A lot of Western countries are probably going to stick to their treaty on conventional munitions. DPICM's dud rate for cluster is just outside of what that treaty, which has a lot of European nations in it, allows. Just outside. It's just above a 2% dud rate. Soviet stockpiles are running out. And there's critical areas of those stockpiles that are likely to run out potentially as early as May next year. Well, run out of usable stuff in them. Artillery barrels, artillery breaches, for example. Usable T-72s is another example. And they can't make new T-90Ms fast enough. They can't make new T-80 hulls and turrets fast enough. Another one that they're going to be running headlong into pretty soon is the MP1s. Oh yeah, always. Your losses, unless you fully lean into a very, very heavy war economy, that's just always going to be the case. Because you didn't maintain enough of them at a high enough level to be usable, to be refurbishable. So the Russians have broadly run out of BMP-2s unless they are really, really, really deep overhauls, which generally they don't bring back as normal BMP-2s, they bring back as BMP-2Ms. But their throughput on that is so low it might as well be nothing. At this point, their production of new BMP-3s outweighs the refurbishment of BMP-2s by quite a bit. MTLBs, they have a shitload of, but an MTLB is not a viable APC. It's an artillery tractor. It is not really protected against anything other than like 81 millimeter mortar fragmentation from like 100 meters away. It's not. BMDs were not produced in even the same amount as BMP-1s. Okay. The Russians have lost around about 4,000 IFVs in this war. So what we're likely to start seeing them do is just lean heavier and heavier on the BTR-80s, BTR-70s, right? And potentially even BTR-60s that they have in stocks. Well, I just answered that one. Yeah, there's that conversion. There's a similar conversion with that same turret of BMP-1. Right now, the most common quote-unquote IFV in Ukraine on the Russian side is a BMP-1 with no ATGM.
Just a BMP-1 with the gun. That's it.
Yeah.
I think that's a terrible.
Because you have to turn out to use... With a BMP-1, you have to turn out to use the ATGM.
But that thing has... Okay, the 70mm gun's heat round isn't terrible, but it's not great. And it's
it is pretty terrible. It's really only designed to engage targets out to 500 meters. It's designed to cover the gap inward from Maldyutka, so Sagar. HE shells, like it's capable of firing HE. That's probably its number one most useful role. But the primary use of that turret is the PKT machine gun. So they're really just APCs. Yeah, there have been all sorts of lovely modifications of MTLBs,
They're very
from
sort of thing, though.
from twin 45 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, twin 25 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, to throwing an MT 1200 millimeter anti-tank gun on top of them. All sorts of loveliness.
Was, of course, the amount of losses is staggering. You're talking about fighting an industrial scale war without any of the casualty reducing aids that we have seen used in wars like the 1991 Gulf War or the 2003
Yeah.
invasion of Iraq. The
So,
Ukrainians
Woods.
and the Russians don't have Kasabak on tap all the time. The Ukrainians and the Russians don't have air superiority to reduce casualties by softening the enemy up from the air. The Ukrainians and the Russians don't have the sheer amount of, well, they don't anymore, the sheer amount of fire that will reduce positions before troops go in. The Russians had that for a good chunk of the early part of the war.
It's beyond that. So the biggest thing you can do to reduce casualties, right, both in terms of equipment losses and personnel losses, is concentrate firepower and force. You need to overwhelm an enemy position if you have to take it or break through it. So again, all of 1st Infantry Division, right, a mechanized infantry division in 1991, with the rest of 7th Corps backing them up with firepower, right, in one afternoon got focused on a single Iraqi brigade of that one mechanized infantry division of the Iraqi army they were arrayed against. Okay, so you had shitloads of firepower thrown at them, ton of air power, and then you had basically 2 brigades up on line engaging a single brigade to cover the breaching force, which was a full brigade size breaching force. So several battalions were creating breaches at the same time in close proximity to each other, with Corps artillery suppressing enemy artillery. Okay, so this is something neither the Russians or the Ukrainians can do. They can really only beat their head against the wall. So MTLBs with 23 millimeter anti-aircraft guns are pretty common as a way to make mobile that gun. You see it also on the VDV's APCs a lot. The BTR-ZD, right, or BTR-D. The ZD is indicative they've welded the mount basically on. Well, they've welded an adapter for the mount onto the thing, and all they got to do is ratchet strap it down, and it's good. So those are fairly common. You're not really going to see conversions. The need for this war is way too high, and neither side has enough protected mobility for its forces. This is one of the reasons I'm so frustrated with the lack of volume of M113 APCs that is going to Ukraine. Yeah, the West has given them a lot of M113s, but compared to what we could give them, it's nothing. Okay, and that would be huge for the Ukrainians. Battalions of tanks here and there mean nothing. The U.S. has entire valleys full of M113s out in the desert that are in pretty good condition. Same thing with Bradleys. Okay, Abrams would require more effort because they'd have to go through and be overhauled. Those aren't ACAVs. But just the sheer mass. RO600 from Egypt, Woods. The U.S. has thousands sitting in storage in relatively rapidly refurbishable condition. And by rapidly, I mean a sustainment brigade can easily bring them back. Okay? Or just a depot could. Easily. There are Turpits. something like 30 to 50,000 M113s were made. It is the singularly most produced armored vehicle in history.
It's just good.
Because it's an aluminum armored box on tracks with a John Deere transmission. Like, it's not complex.
You can bolt machine guns to it. You can bolt a bloody autocannon on top if you want. You can bolt an ATGM on top if you want. Stick a mortar in the back. It can carry
M113s. So let me put it to you this way, gunnery officer. Would you rather be under artillery fire in an M113 or sitting in the back of a pickup or walking?
I'll take the M113, thanks, cyclic, if that's not too much trouble.
And which one of those three is going to allow you to move through mud faster?
I'd also point out, yeah, sure, they might not be protected from small arms from the side.
They will protect you from small arms from the side. It's 50 cal, that's the problem.
Ah, fair enough. In that case then, sure, I'll take an M113. As long as it takes something bigger than a rifle to kill me, I'm fine.
And here's the thing. Compared to a BTR or a BMP, if you drive over an anti-tank mine, you're far more likely to get out of an M113 alive.
Hey.
Right. So, and the U.S. has a lot more M2A2 ODSs that it can give. A lot more. Well, even the Ukrainian BTRs that have doors going out the back because they, grew a brain and decided to put the engine up front. An M113 is pretty survivable. Now those BTR4s, they're pretty survivable too.
Is that the one with the
But
turret on top that looks really big?
no, just search BTR4E.
I will have a look. 'Cause I think I know what you mean. Oh, that thing! I didn't realise that was related to traditional BTR. I thought
Mhm.
it was a new vehicle.
It is. Comes out of the same family.
Oh, it looks a lot more sensible.
Yes, because it's not hard to be more sensible than the Soviet BTR lineage. Like really not hard.
Also, that's a beefy cannon on top. What is that, 30 mil?
It's a 30. Yep.
Nice.
And generally they have 2 ATGMs.
Nice. Are they building them in relatively decent numbers? Have they continued to build them during this war?
Yeah, they have. I mean, they're never going to keep up with their losses, but
Still, it's something.
there's one big problem with it. It's not a dual feed autocannon. It's single feed. So you can't select between two different 30mm rounds.
Oh,
Like
right.
AP and HE, you're one or the other. This is why early on we had some video of BTRs just hammering BMPs with HE until they finally killed it. That's why, because that's what they had loaded in the vehicle.
So they pulled the trigger with what rounds they had because the alternative
Yeah,
was not fun.
because you're going to ruin the day of the BMP crew, and eventually you're going to mulch it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So,
All in all, a very decent looking, punchy APC, not an IFV, APC.
it's more of an wheeled IFV.
Fair enough. Is
The BTRs are all capable of it, and I mean, the 113 can do that too.
would you say?
So,
Would you say that obviously would you say what makes something an IFV is how it's used rather than what the armament is nowadays? Or would
no,
you say-
it's a balance of protection, armament, and capabilities.
So if
The Warrior, for example, I would the current version of the Warrior, not the upgraded version, I would actually consider an APC.
fair enough.
It's not truly capable of supporting the infantry on the move.
Whereas the BTR-4
And throughout the attack. Yes. Like a Russian BTR-82 is not able to really do that. So that means it's an APC. A BMP-1 AM with that, 30mm turret that the Russians put on the BTR-82 that's an APC as well, because it's not capable of supporting the infantry. It's infantry in the advance.
Okay, so just this is actually really interesting because I think I understand where you're coming from. I feel like I need a little bit more. So Warrior, BTR-82, and the BMP with that 30 mil aren't capable of supporting infantry on the advance, but the BTR-40 is. The only difference I can see between the vehicles, as I look at them, is that the BTR-40 has 280 GMs.
Stabilizer.
Oh, is that the difference?
The Warrior is not stabilized.
Is that the problem? Is it a lack of a stabilizer?
That's one of the big problems. Also, the Warrior's autocannon reloads from 3-round clips and has a hilariously low rate of fire.
Oh no, I'm not denying that Warrior's not an IFV. I understand why that's.
It's what I'm getting at here is it's not capable of putting the fire down to provide meaningful support.
Right.
Fleet.
Okay. So that's the real key point here. Putting the fire down to provide the support. I think I understand.
Like, compare a Bradley to Warrior.
Oh god, yeah, I think I see what you mean.
Compare Puma to a Warrior, or not Puma, Martyr to a Warrior.
I think I see.
Martyr isn't stabilized, but it's capable of putting down a heck of a lot more fire to protect its infantry.
And so you consider those two IFVs, but the Russian BMP with the 30 mil isn't.
It's not stabilized. It's not an accurate autocannon.
Right.
Like
So
it would,
accuracy
like
also
it.
factors into
It struggles to hit the inside of a barn from inside a barn.
So it's not just
Levels of
having-
barrel whip on it. Yeah.
So it's not just having rate of fire. You can't just put fire down. It's got to be accurate fire.
It's got to be useful fire. Yes.
Okay. I understand fully what you're driving at now. Yeah, I completely on the same page now. Thanks for that. Because the last thing I want to do is ask stupid questions when I have the person to answer them right there. So I find it interesting that both the APC and the IFV have survived into the modern era rather than the thought process that went through that the IFV would replace the APC.
Well, by and large, in most normal militaries, the IFV has replaced the APC. It's a rare thing when a ground army goes back from even a really bad IFV to, that's borderline APC, depending on who you ask, to APC that's only got a heavy machine gun. Right? That's very rare. Gunnery officer, the Puma, later versions of the Puma are getting ATGMs. They're getting spikes.
They've also got a really gnarly autocannon.
It's not that great of an autocannon. It's reasonable, but it's not that particularly great.
I do still, on the subject of autocannons quickly, I do still find it funny that the Bofors L70 is still knocking around with the CV90. That's just...
yeah, it's a really bad one for putting in an IFV because of ammunition considerations.
Oh god, really?
Yes.
Why haven't they replaced it then? The Swedes aren't stupid.
Because they feel that the HE is worth it.
Oh.
Despite the fact that, you know, you gotta constantly reload a bin with clips, and
Oh god, it's like
that you
Warrior
don't have that many,
again.
that you don't, well, unlike Warrior, you know, your feed size isn't 2 clips of 3 rounds. It's an entire bin with like 60 rounds ready, 40 to 60 rounds ready, something like that. But you know, the CV9040 doesn't particularly carry a great amount of troops. It carries about as much as Bradley. Doesn't have an ATGM, and carries far fewer rounds. Far fewer rounds than the Bradley. Okay. There's ammunition trade-offs there. And this is one of the bigger questions regarding the U.S. and the 50 millimeter autocannon in XM30. But that at least is just necked up 35 millimeter ammunition, because the full diameter of the case is 50. The 40 millimeter ammunition for the Bofors is not a straight wall, as far as I am aware. Somebody can correct me on that if I'm wrong. It doesn't make good use of ammunition stowage in the vehicle on the CV90. The 35 isn't much better on the CV90. Really, the only CV90 that has reasonable ammunition accommodation is the 30 millimeter armed one.
Didn't they also try sticking? Did BAE also try this weird scheme to stick a 105 and a 120 in the CV90?
Not as an infantry fighting
Oh, no,
vehicle.
no,
That was just using the chassis to make a sort of a light tank-esque thing, or an
Yeah.
infantry support vehicle.
Still seems a bit of a stretch.
Well, when you look at the M10 Booker, that is an ASCOD slowly turned into, with changes, into an assault gun. Like, there's plenty of these things out there. As ways for getting additional HE throwing firepower to infantry formations. So programmable HE in 30 millimeter and up autocannons for armored fighting vehicles is a thing, gunnery officer. The Stryker Dragoon for its 30 millimeter chain gun has it. Like, it's 30 millimeter and up. It's a very common thing for HE to have a programmable fuse. It's nothing out of the ordinary. Like, yeah, you saw it first in the 40 millimeter before it got down to 30, but because electronics have come down in size over the years, but
God damn it. The more I have these modern era discussions, the more I realize just how little I actually know about this sort of stuff. And I'm actually willing to admit it. Is there... Okay, apart from the obvious answer of the bloody Bradley, is there an ideal IFV on the market today?
CV9030 is not bad. Some of the versions of KF41 links aren't bad. So IKV91 wasn't really adopted, Scoot, as far as I'm aware. Like there are a couple IFVs I'd say are really good.
No, apparently...
But not many.
Apparently IKV91 was adopted.
Interesting. Okay.
212 entered service with the Swedish Army. Retired in the late 90s.
No, I stand corrected.
Which is interesting. I mean, the Swedes themselves said it wasn't a light tank; it was an assault gun, which I think is an interesting proposal.
Dardo isn't bad either. It's just kind of old now. The Italian IFV. Striker's useful for a medium weight mechanized infantry. Yes, the French do. Yeah, I know that's not Dardo Turpitz.
I mean, the French are very keen on mobility when it comes to their...
Yeah, the French. I don't remember the name of it. VBCI, I think. Because acronyms in France. Yeah, it's all right. I mean, I'm not gonna call it great, but
Oh yeah, the wheeled French IFE, yeah.
adequate.
Yeah, that doesn't...
So VBCI replaced AMX 10P. No, Jaguar is not IFV. It's a reconnaissance vehicle. Well, reconnaissance and fire support.
Seems like the French came to the same conclusions that the Americans did when it came to autocannon with the 25mm range.
That's a 20, I believe.
No, there's a 25. I'm just, I mean, obviously,
Okay,
obviously,
okay.
It's Wikipedia, so it could be wrong, but still.
Yeah, it's probably a 25. Well, it can be equipped with different sets of turrets with different things.
Well, that's fine.
So generally speaking, wheeled vehicles are going to be lighter than tracked. Generally, this is not always true. Looks at Boxer. It's tall because the French want certain things in it. They want certain perspective or certain protection requirements. They want a certain carrying capacity. That's all going to drive a much bigger vehicle in a wheeled vehicle than in a tracked, but it's still going to be lighter. Yeah, Ghost, I would concur with that whole thing about a nation going from a really shitty borderline IFV APC back to an APC that's only got a heavy machine gun. Yeah, I was talking about the UK.
The one thing that gets me, just while we're on the topic of France, is that France has...
Turpitz, that's not aggressive reconnaissance. Aggressive reconnaissance is 14 Abrams jumping down your throat.
I'm sorry, all I can see now is just a position of a hostile force over a hill, and then suddenly 10 Abrams just crest the ridgeline and are like aggressive reconnaissance.
Aggressive reconnaissance is what 3 Corps ACR did to the Republican Guard's Tawakama division at 73 Eastings.
Surprise!
3 Corps reconnaissance force eliminating an armored division.
Oh god, that's beautiful. That's glorious.
Welcome to an ACR. Enjoy your... Well, maybe not enjoy, but enjoy your... Oh, sorry, I meant to say 7 Corps. I had been saying 7 Corps all afternoon, Annie, with the... I just misspoke.
On the topic of things that are slightly speedy, that are slightly aggressive, the thing that gives me the most mindfuck about French armoured vehicles is that they have not one, but 2 6-wheeled armoured cars with a 105.
Those are both being replaced, so...
It's more the fact that they just had 2 for the longest time, that were basically the same thing. I mean, apart from them looking different, they did basically the same fucking job. Also, what are they being replaced with?
Jaguar.
Nice.
40mm autocannon and... what is it? 5th generation ATGM?
So the French are happy to lose that large gun, the 105. They're happy to give that.
So those 105s are fairly low pressure.
Oh really?
Yes.
Fair enough. I will admit the Centauros are funny. Just casually straps one.
So Annie's just given you an answer to the 2. Again, it comes down to deployability between them and weight.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you very much. Which was which, by the way? Just so that I've got it in my head, so I don't make a stupid mistake again.
The view.
You could chuck a Land Rover in a Chinook.
You can.
That's just chuck it in the Chinook, eh?
It is really something.
Meanwhile, the 101st Airborne over there getting a full full divisional set of
Thank you.
ISVs.
So is Booker air mobile?
Air transportable, yes.
But you can't toss it out the back of an aircraft.
No. Well, you can, but don't expect it to be intact when it gets to the ground,
Yeah,
or after it gets to the ground. Yeah, it's you land the C-17 at an area that troops have secured, and then
Out comes the
drive two of them out the back. Yeah. Not a C5. You're not doing C5s like that, Woods. It's not designed for that in the slightest.
C5.
That's really a C-17 role.
Actually, that's the point. What's the difference between a strategic and a tactical airlifter?
Range, speed, payload, way it's intended to be operated. You're not flying a C5 into a hastily cleared airstrip, and when I say airstrip, I do mean airstrip. It's dirt into the middle of Syria to support U.S. anti-ISIS operations in Syria, right? Instead, the C5s are going to be flying in to Djibouti or Cyprus or UAE or Oman, right? And then that stuff is going to get moved to a C-17 or a C-130 for that final leg into the rough field.
I know that a lot of European air forces have been replacing C-130 with A-400.
I mean, A-400 is a better aircraft for what they need. It's overkill for what the U.S. needs the C-130 for, but
is the US going to get a C-130 replacement at all?
eventually, but not for a little while. You're liable to see a C5 replacement first.
Oh yeah, I mean,
The 130J refresh of the fleet has set the C-130s for a while.
Nice. So, any idea what? So, because I was under the I appear to be mistaken impression that the C-17 was the C-5 replacement.
No, absolutely not. It was a C-141 replacement.
Right. So the C-5 replacement will be something of similar size.
No, they do not.
I will admit that those joint Franco-Italian twin-engine tactical transports are very cute. They are the adorable small boys of NATO. It's like a C-130, but someone's cut two of the engines off. I mean, to be fair, like the ATR company had a lot of success selling their like tactical transports can go even smaller than that. Like you can have.
Yeah, but their use is very limited.
Oh no, I'm not denying that. But it's more the fact that they can, which is still interesting to me. So, how much life do you reckon C5's got left in it? Decade? 5 years?
Well, given that the Air Force has already started the preliminary of its replacement, which should have began a decade ago. But yeah, right now we don't really have a timeline. We just know the Air Force is interested in some sort of a blended wing body aircraft for it. Because the C5's already big enough that it's airfield restricted anyways. So blended wing body is not really going to be that big of an issue.
Like, if you're going to be airfield restricted, you may as well go for something that brings more airlift capacity to the market, to the platform. I've got 2 sets of radar. Is that some sort of small AWACS platform?
No, that's a maritime patrol aircraft.
Oh god, so that's a small maritime patrol aircraft.
A lot of nations use modified biz jets too.
Wow. The more I know.
Doesn't take something to be that big.
Today I learned. What's the point of a maritime? Yeah, I was gonna say being said what I was gonna say. What's the point of a maritime patrol aircraft if it can't do any submarine warfare?
Because the primary role of a maritime patrol aircraft is maritime domain awareness, not necessarily ASW.
Fair enough. The thing is, IKB, the airfield restrictions aren't really a problem for things like the C5.
The C5 is out there to do strategic airlift, not tactical. It's not flying into airfields close to the front line or behind enemy lines or rough strips. It's there to transport stuff from, in the U.S. context, from CONUS, continental United States, to a hub. It's a hub-to-hub thing, like a 747 used to be in its designed context, was to fly you from one big hub to another big hub for regional aircraft to take you somewhere else. That's broadly what C5s do.
I will admit, Starlifter was a very attractive aircraft. Starlifter was very good looking, in my opinion. Look, everybody likes the buff, but we all have to accept that the buff will disappear eventually. At some point. In the future. I have to believe that, because otherwise the world is insane. The buff cannot live forever. I mean, heck, it's part of the point. The whole point of the B-21, well, one of the points of the B-21, is to phase out the B-52 and B-1 fleets. And just have a single, well, not single force, because the B-2s will still exist in some form, but they'll be the...
They're actually liable to be retired before the B1s.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, because they're dramatically more expensive to operate. They're a dramatically smaller force. It's another reason, like, the F-22s are liable to be the first thing that NGAD replaces. So, as irritating as it is for me for B-21 to replace B-1B, it's what is currently in production. The U.S. does not have the money to run a true B-1B replacement as a intercontinental cruise missile slinger. Ideally, for cruise missile slingers, you do want a supersonic aircraft because it allows you to get to a launch point quickly and unpredictably.
Okay.
But supersonic bombers are hilariously expensive.
Yeah. So your ideal B-1B replacement would be some form of supersonic bomber.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not never going to happen in any realistic world.
I'm not going to say never going to happen. But it is unlikely to happen because of the expense.
The US is not made of money. I know, I just said heresy, but it's true.
I mean, we have other things we need to spend money on. Like the Air Force needs to dramatically refresh its fighter fleet. So internally they can carry 24. You'll note I say internally because the outer pylons are coming back.
Hey.
Including the external, I think you're looking at about 36 per.
36? God damn.
Per aircraft. Backfire, eat your heart out.
Yeah, fuck backfire. Give me a fleet of B1s. And as far as I'm aware, the Russians can't beat that with anything in their inventory. Not even bloody Tu-95 can lug that many.
They don't have any bomber-launched anti-ship missile other than KH-22 and 32.
Is it literally just the backfire fleet that can carry their...
And the Su-34 fleet. It sounds like they're slowly just going to be replacing the backfire force with Su-34s.
Isn't that a degradation in capability? I mean,
No,
oh,
no.
oh, okay.
So I think long term their plan is for 34 to be able to fire a version of Kinjal as well.
Fair enough.
And yes, I'm aware Kinjal is just a air-launched ballistic missile.
But it's still a.
Well, when you look at the majority of NATO navies still not having true ballistic missile, anti-ballistic missile capability, well, you know.
Yeah.
But although the French Navy has kind of added themselves to that list, at least for tactical ballistic or short-range ballistic missile defense. So the reason I say even Su-34 with, say you embiggen KH-31, right? Or you decide you want to put Onyx as an air-launched version. If the Russians wanted to spend the money, they could do it. Case in point is BrahMos air-launched. Onyx and BrahMos are practically the same missile. The reason that is a dramatically improved capability over backfire with KH-22 and KH-32 is simply because you're firing a fucking sea skimmer.
I see.
And you're doing so with a modern missile that doesn't need the aircraft to initially require radar lock.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, see, the backfires have to get within the radar horizon of what they're targeting.
Oh, shit.
Get back to me when SM6 says hi.
Yeah, this.
Get back to me when you manage to get past the Super Hornets.
Get back to him when you manage to just exist.
The Super Hornets that are carrying 10 AIM-120Ds and 2 Sidewinders.
Oh my fucking god, Cyclic. Please have mercy on the backfires.
No. Put them down like the dogs they are.
Oh, god, that's funny. Oh, Jesus Christ. Red, yeah, we've all, well, I've listened to Red Storm Rising, the audiobook, and, yeah.
Like, I don't really tend to agree with people who whinge about the Tomcat's retirement. I don't.
Well, no, like, why would you? They were maintenance hogs.
Because a Super Hornet can carry 10 AIM-120Ds. Is it the ideal platform for it? No. Could a modernized Tomcat carry a lot more? Yes. Look at the cost, though.
Yeah, but a modernized Tomcat would make handkerchiefs commit suicide at an incredibly rapid rate.
Now, if you want to whinge about the retirement of the A6, I will happily agree with you.
Oh, go on.
Oh, yeah.
Go on, Cyclic, go for it.
The A6 was due an update and was going to get it after the A12 failed. And the A12 wasn't a great aircraft, if I'm going to be brutally honest. It was not the aircraft the Navy needed, and the A6 would have been a far better bomb truck than relying entirely upon Super Hornets for GWAT.
They were trying
High
to build a-
performance fighter attack aircraft do not make efficient bomb trucks to go bomb people in tents.
They were gonna fucking create a stealth bomber for the US Navy. What the fuck were they thinking? Idiots.
So in the context of the 90s, it made a lot of sense. The problem was that context only exists for the 90s, where you are primarily still using direct attack munitions as your precision strike capability. Okay? And you don't have a very high-end enemy. Okay? It makes a lot of sense there when your primary threat is ground forces. However, for GWAT, and even today, with the primary standoff, with standoff being your primary means of striking, even for stealth aircraft in highly contested airspace, Just slap 4 JASM ERs on the sucker,
Can I just say,
launch it off the cat, let it cruise out to its launch position, drop them, come back home. The pilot's going to be sipping coffee the whole damn way.
can I just say this? If this is the correct aircraft that I found, it looks goofy.
Yes, it is the Flying Dorito.
It looks goofy as fuck, and I hate it.
It's also not a good use of hangar space.
I can see that. As in, I actually have the thing here, actually, that they published. Like, this thing is just silly. I'm just gonna post it here, quickly. Look at that. That's just... How do you... Who approved this? Who came up with this?
The hype after F-117.
You know what? That explains a lot. Oh, hello, Slayer. Hello, resident
And-
Air Force member.
Don't get me wrong, right? Great all aspect stealth. The problem was its ordnance carrying capability for standoff munitions would have forced it to be retired by the end of the 1990s.
Let me guess. A hope and a prayer?
Well, no, you're restricted entirely to internal base.
Exactly. A hope and a prayer. One missile.
It could carry like 2, maybe 4 at most 2,000-pound bombs.
That's it. That's it.
And it was supposed to replace the A6.
The A6 that could log more throw weight than a B-17.
Well, that's not that particularly impressive. The B-17 by 1960s standards was hilariously lightweight. But
It was more just for the lay people in the audience.
an A6 can carry a huge amount of ordnance. A Super Hornet can carry a huge amount of ordnance.
I mean, the Super Hornet really is a multi-role aircraft. It can be an interceptor, it can be a fighter, it can be a ground pounder. A Super Hornet can be anything you want it to be.
Yeah. So when you look at the context of the 1990s and this thing, like, yeah, it makes sense why they went for it. It's not a good aircraft for the long term. It dramatically... Okay, an F-35C does this thing's job infinitely better and does more.
Hey, F-35.
Okay?
Everybody loves F-35.
So the problem, Waifu, isn't the fact that it's 8,000 pounds of ordnance. The problem is that you realistically have to fit everything inside an internal weapons bay, which means you can't carry outsized munitions, right? This thing would never have been able to carry JASM ER. The modern JASM ER, so what used to be XR. Trying to fit this thing with the incoming Halo, forget it.
Would you help me put something to bed? Like I keep getting
Mhm.
asked this question a long time, and I've tried to put it to bed myself, but I don't think I have the gravitas and detailed knowledge to kill it. People keep asking, will the USN or can the USN ever bring back any of the Iowas because China? And I keep saying no, they can't.
Why would you ever bring them back? A single Burke has more useful firepower.
I brought that up as well, but the question keeps being asked, so I tried to...
Because people are stupid.
Yes, I know. But I tried to pivot to the why it's impossible angle, and could do with some help elaborating exactly why you physically can't bring them back.
The machinery doesn't run.
And also, the guns would need realigning, even if...
Well, you wouldn't even use the guns because the guns weren't there for anti-surface.
Oh no, I'm aware. It's more just adding additional weight to my argument.
Annie, we're not even going to let that happen. Like, I'm not in the mood for myself having an aneurysm. Like, there is no reason. The armor is useless. They are less survivable than a Burke. They are less bulkheaded. They have less watertight spaces. Okay? They are less survivable, less firepower. The 16-inch guns are fucking meaningless even if they did work.
Yes, for 90s money, VLS Tychos are cheap to operate and build than Iowas by a country mile. Easily. It's not even a fucking contest. Why do you...
The Iowas were replaced fundamentally by the VLS sprue cans. Because their role was to be missile trucks, not to be battleships.
There, let it be buried. I don't want to have to talk about the Iowas fucking again. Even I'm getting sick of it. I mean, and the cyclic will tell you, until I was educated, I used to be one of the big gun idiots, didn't I?
Yeah, I believe I had to beat you over the head with a cast iron pipe repeatedly.
Yeah, but it worked though, didn't it?
Eventually.
We got there in the end, didn't we? Arsenal ships are and remain a stupid idea. Well, the US has them.
Hang.
The US has them. They're called the bloody Iowas with...
No.
Oh, sorry, not Iowas.
No.
Ios with bloody...
No.
SGNs.
No.
Aren't they?
No. And no.
Ouch. Don't shout. I mean, they give the same...
No.
People say Arsenal ships.
No.
Okay.
No. An Arsenal ship is a converted merchant ship with VLS thrown in it.
What?
Yes.
Really?
Yes, and it's stupid and it doesn't work.
Well, yes, we know that. I was more referring to the whole ability to lob large amounts of missiles down. We have the Ohio SGNs for that. I was not aware that Arsenal ships referred to that specific concept. I assumed it was just a vessel armed purely with VLS missiles. I was not aware it was that.
Isn't that just called a ship? Like a vessel armed with VLS? Isn't that just called a warship?
Purely with VLS.
If you're intelligent, yes.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, the gun is kind of useful for, like, shooting at pirates or whatever, but, like, isn't that just
Or
called a
drones.
warship?
Yeah.
And drones, too. But, like, isn't that just called a warship at that point?
You would think so,
Mhm.
wouldn't you?
Generally, the concept most people think of when you start talking about an arsenal ship
Anyways, going back.
is what you see in chat right now that Scoot put in. This is dumb.
Yes, I am.
This is too much firepower concentrated in a single ship unable to truly defend itself.
Yes, that is true.
Unable to take a hit.
That is also true.
Okay?
I'm aware of that.
You are also, it's all concentrated in one position. I'm not talking to you now, Fleet. I'm talking to the person who asked.
Fair enough.
Concentrated in one position. Guess what? That's really only going to affect one area. What I would rather have, let's see, I'm going to assume those are 64 cell blocks, right? What I would rather have is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cruisers,
Nice.
okay? Or destroyers, because that is something I can put in 5 different spots. I could have those all up and down the first island chain with some frigates with them. And all of a sudden, I can hit 80% of China that matters. Right? And losing one of those doesn't lose me all of that striking capacity.
I hate those.
Arsenal ships are bad ideas. The Korean Navy is stupid for pursuing them.
Wait, they're not actually pursuing them, are they?
They're pursuing what they're calling an arsenal ship, which is a militarized version, so it's a little bit more survivable. And there are some pressures why they're doing this because of their manpower constraints. It's still a dumb idea. They're not really arsenal ships in the conventional sense, as Phoenix says. They're kind of cruisers-ish, but not cruisers.
So, okay. So, given the firepower and capabilities of modern destroyers, because I had this question asked a couple of weeks ago and I wasn't able to actually answer it. And the answer I basically gave was, you basically have to go off what the Navy in question calls their ships. Where is the line between a cruiser and a destroyer nowadays? Does it even
Phoenix, are you able to pop in voice? Bring Phoenix up.
Will do.
There we go. We here? We're here. Excellent. Okay. So, the line between a cruiser and a destroyer, there is none. The cruiser's been dead for 50 years. Now, Cyclic might disagree with me a little bit here, but so the main thing
Not
to keep in mind
practically.
is that the main thing to keep in mind is that the cruiser destroyer distinguishing existed in the Cold War pretty specifically based off the capabilities of the ships in question. So remember, the average Cold War destroyer or fleet escort, whatever you wanted to call it, was a destroyer with one Mark 13 launcher that could throw a Tartar or a Rim 66. And that was your average Cold War destroyer. I mean, that was being built. I mean, obviously the U.S. Navy switched to something more ambitious, the Ticonderoga class, in the start of in the 1980s. But other nations were still building that classic Cold War DDG up until the 1990s. If you look at, some of the last French and Italian Cold War destroyers, or the Sovereignettes from the Soviet Union, which are roughly equivalent. Now you have another category of ship above this, which. Technically, there were two because the U.S. Navy did build one true post-war cruiser, Long Beach, before they gave up on them. But the U.S. Navy had ships that they called frigates at that point in time up until 1975. And these were all the Terrier ships. Some of them were multi-ended Tartar ships. But they called them frigates. They were a tier above destroyers but below cruisers. And cruisers in this sense being like Long Beach, and the gun cruisers converted into like Terrier and Taylor ships. And the Italians also had cruisers that were helicopter cruisers, roughly in this category. And the French also had one cruiser and then two frigates, which were basically they were in their term of frigate. It was equivalent to the American large frigates that became cruisers. This is actually the way the French used frigate before they even applied the smaller ships in the way that like the British would or the Italians would. The French didn't start using frigate in that sense until really the 1990s. And the thing is, this definition of cruiser really died off starting in the 1970s as technology moved on. Destroyer designs got larger, particularly the Americans. They really went to kick this off with the Ticonderoga class destroyers, where you could basically build a destroyer that would have the kind of the air defense capabilities that a lot of these cruisers used to have, especially as the U.S. Navy kind of moved away from the arm-launched, boostered SAMs, the Rim 67 family that's on a Terrier. And, in particular, once you got VLS on the Ticonderogas, right, suddenly there is no distinguishing between ships that can launch Rim 66 or an extended range SAM, just because the U.S. Navy made the conscious choice that, VLS is going to be able to launch not just SAMs, which is the initial thought for Mark 41, but also everything can carry a Tomahawk, so thus strike length, thus they can take extended range SAMs. And this really kicked off a trend where basically you didn't need to have ships, as long as ships had the capability to launch one type of SAM, they were generally going to have the capability to launch another one, so long as you could take a medium range SAM in the first place. This really killed off the general role of a cruiser in almost every navy. Like the Italians never built another cruiser after Vittorio Veneto in the 1960s. They kind of replaced her with really carriers. The French also never really replaced their large ships in that sense. They basically just merged again the capability of the fleet escorts, which were equivalent to destroyers, and the cruisers/frigates with the HAMS ships. The British never had guided missile cruisers at all. The Americans, they renamed the Ticonderoga class into cruisers, but really they just kept plugging along with destroyers. The Burkes are just a cheaper version of the Ticonderogas.
Phoenix just muted. Yeah, they just muted themselves.
So
Probably because Phoenix is at work at the moment.
fair enough. So in a way, I was on the right track from what I.
All right, we're back. Sorry about that. Yeah. So anywho, really the main thing, but if you look at cruiser classes in general, like ships actually designed as cruisers and laid down as such, the last ship of a new class of dedicated cruisers was Slava, aka Moskva, that was just sunk in 2022, and she was laid down in 1974. 1976. No, 76. Kirov was 1974. But that was really your last actual new cruiser class. Because again, the Ticonderogas were originally a destroyer design. Hang on, I'm gonna have to mute myself again in a second.
So it is kind of like what I've been saying.
To jump off of Phoenix for a second, I think the definition of cruiser, and the line between cruiser and destroyer, is from a fundamental level, like something we could point out, but not something we could just necessarily define. Mainly because, philosophically speaking, it really just depends on the country in question. Now, it's like to take a look at, like, I don't know, say the USN is very special because they define cruisers as basically an ability to launch Terrier, and then the RIM 67 or SM2ER or SM1ER platforms. And that's not going to really apply to the Russians or the Soviets because they don't really have that definition. They have like the Kidnas and then the going down that line in terms of what a cruiser is. You can kind of get a general sense of the question, but like it's literally so dependent on who you're talking about specifically that my kind of stance on it is that everything is an escort ship, and then
Alright, I'm back. by the way.
definitions are pointless.
I mean, to be honest with you, I actually kind of agree with both of you.
They're not opposing. They're not okay. I don't. Everything is not an escort ship. Don't take that one seriously.
Well, no, it wasn't.
So I think the main thing is that when you're talking about what ship roles, like different ship roles, you got to like look at how the navies use the term and what roles they actually fill. Because for example, I'd say while cruisers are pretty definitively dead, destroyers are still have a role that they pretty specifically perform. That most navies will. That's what most navies mean when they say destroyer, which is the area air defense role. The Italians use this term as such. The Americans do. The Chinese do. The Indians do. Japan is kind of different because they have just everything as an escort, but even they do specify DDG versus DD. Their DDs are really the equivalent of frigates for most navies.
Except for frigates.
But the Royal Navy does this as well. The Australians, most of the large navies, most of the navy, like the navies that matter, will call it as such. Even the Russians do, to be honest. And then everything else below that is going to be a frigate, and it lacks the area air defense capabilities. There's only really a handful of navies that actually will call something with area air defense capability a frigate, which is the French. Because the French is very specific to the way French designations go, because their equivalent term for destroyer way back, like I'm talking like in the interwar era, they never had an equivalent term for destroyer that meant like the multi-role destroyer others navies had. They had two separate terms that encompassed two specific roles for fleet destroyers or destroyer equivalent ships. And those roles were just obsolete after 1951, so they stopped using them then and there, and shifted to other descriptions.
The French are also interesting because the French are also interesting because they didn't really have a during World War II period of ship design, so
Yeah.
it's hard to.
Like, if you're looking at the interwar ships, so like for most navies, they fought World War II with the designs they had in the interwar era and had built then or were starting to build. Only really a handful of designs really got pumped out that were actually designed and built during World War II, primarily from the U.S. Navy. Otherwise, it was mostly like low-end mobilizations type designs, like corvettes and the like. But because in the case of the French specifically, right, you had, and I'm gonna massacre the French pronunciation, so I'm gonna stick with mostly English way of saying these. But they had basically two categories. So closest to conventional destroyers is a term that translates closely as fleet torpedo boat. And their thing was stick with the battleships. You only have to be like 3 knots or 5 knots faster than the battleships. Your primary role is torpedoing the enemy battle line. Your secondary role is defending your battle line against enemy destroyers. But they're very much torpedo warfare is your thing, and you stick with the battleships. The other type are the very famous contre-torpilleurs.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, which are which basically in terms of translation does literally come out to like anti-torpedo boat. But they are actually, because again their design was very specific to countering the Italian light scouts, exploratory leggetti, which are basically large destroyers that they used as cheaper versions of scout cruisers. These French.
Yeah, they basically both pointed designs as ships built to counter each other at each other.
Sort of. I mean, the thing is, on the Italian side, this is something they came up with to fight in the Adriatic primarily, and the French after World War One had no scout cruiser designs, had only torpedo boats, so they needed something that could counter these smaller ships, because the Italians had a very heavy scouting advantage, and in any phase of naval warfare, scouting capability, anti-scout capability is hugely important. But just to get back to the original point, the role of these French large destroyers, their primary role was to act as the fleet scout and to deal with enemy scouts. That came first and foremost, and then like a secondary role, defend against enemy torpedo craft, and then the very, very last role, like lowest priority role, was actually torpedoing enemy major warships, and they were really designed to operate either in independent divisions or alongside the cruiser forces, which are faster, but really the 10,000-ton treaty cruisers first, most of all. Because the armored light cruisers that they had, the like 8,000-ton ships, were really meant to stick with the battleships. But again, so these were very specific roles, whereas other navies, the destroyers, are generally much more jack of all trades, multi-role types. Even the normal Italian destroyers, because the Italians had both destroyers and the light scouts that they built up to really like the mid 1920s, the Navigatore class are the last ones they tried of that before they moved on to cruiser-sized ships. But anyway, getting back to the original point though, in terms of guided missile ships, right, and who you actually use this frigate to decide area air warfare ships, setting things to French aside, because we already covered them, you really have the Dutch with the D7 Provincian class, and the Germans with the F-124s, which are, some would argue, are actually frigate size in the first place because they are quite small ships. They're like 5,600 tons, which is very small for ships of their generation as far as AW goes. They only have 32 VLS. Granted, they do have very robust point defense missile systems because they have 2 RAM. But I mean, they have the radar sight to do area warfare, but they have very low magazine capacity. And then there's also the Spanish, or the F100 class, which are they have Spy 1D. They're basically the same. They're designed the Hobart, like the Australian Hobarts are based off of, and they have 48 VLS. But in terms of talking about whose navy, the weight of each navy, like the French navy obviously is well up there. They're like the 6th largest on the planet. They're in some ways trendsetters. They come up with a lot of their own kit. We can give them reasonable weight. Spain a lot less so, and the Netherlands they have a high in capabilities in the navy, but they are relatively speaking a tiny navy. They don't even make the top 20 in terms of tonnage overall. So again, if you're talking about terms of weight and trend setting of what terms actually get used for what, there is a lot more weight behind air defense ships are destroyers versus the term is meaningless. Turpets. So the DLPs would have been, when they were built, they were definitely DDGs. But bear in mind, having a single Mark 13 is basically what the U.S. Navy was able to achieve on the Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates. And even in the modern definition, right, even the Marina Militare does not really consider the DLPs to be proper destroyers. They haven't for a while. They really operate more like frigates now because they still have a decent ASW capability, a very potent anti-surface capability, and they often get used as for training cruises and stuff like that. But they're not really credible area warfare combatants anymore because they're still running RIM 66E. So
to cap off while I've got the host panel up here to round off the question. So if I'm correctly picking up what you're all putting down, which I think I am, you're saying that the cruiser has been dead for 50 years. There are no real cruisers in the world today.
Actually, I'll just present you a question. Fleet, define a chair for me.
It has 4 legs, and you sit on it.
Do they?
Sierra, I know what you're trying to say, and if you let me finish, that's where I was going. What I was going to say is that you basically have to go off whatever a navy in question calls its warships. Because that's how they intend to use them. So if the US Navy says the Tychos
Well-
they're cruisers. If the Chinese say they're stupidly large warships that they've built are destroyers, then they're destroyers.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. Like, even I mean, just because again, to a degree, yes, but then also, there are if you're trying to rationally describe ships, then you can still say some of these are bullshit. So, for example, like the Argentines have a class of Mikos that I think don't have any armor beyond a Speed A for SAMs that they call destroyers. That is obviously very dumb. They're frigates. They're a frigate design. They have, Cold War era frigate capability in terms of air warfare, basically just point defense. They're pretty clearly frigates. And then which if you compare it to the Chinese calling the Type 055s as destroyers, that's actually something that rationally makes sense. The Type 055, though it is larger, has more VLS, does not actually fundamentally bring any capabilities to the table that the Type 052D destroyers do not have. They're just larger, have more VLS, and probably more electrical power generation for the larger, more powerful radars. But they don't have any special version of HHQ-9 that lets them do some things in terms of air warfare that is completely beyond the capabilities of the 052D, the standard destroyer. The way they intend to use them seems to mainly be task force flags, possibly flotilla leaders kind of a thing. And they're not really building a lot of them, which is what's really interesting. I wonder if this is more of a comment on their actual, practical construction capacity limits that they have, right? Because, the way most late navies are looking at future destroyers, they're saying these next big 13,000-ton ships, these will be our mainline destroyers going forwards. Everyone's doing that right now. The Chinese are the only ones who have, gotten those ships into service and are still building more of the smaller type of destroyer. And it is worth noting that the O-52Ds are smaller than average for a lot of modern destroyers. I gotta mute myself for a second.
Fair enough.
I spawned the chair argument. Oh.
Sierra, got down.
It is a genuine question though, because it's like legitimately the question of is the definition by itself is very flexible, and there's no real definition of it compared to it's what is what is a chair?
Oh God,
You can
What have I started? What have I done?
you can certainly define it by set things you sit on a chair supposedly. We can probably all agree on that. We can't agree on what the specifications of does it need to have a back to it? Does it need to have legs? Legitimately, it's a philosophical question more than anything else.
Is there a specific definition between chair and stool?
Yeah.
Oh, please, gentlemen, you're killing me.
And if we go from a chair to a couch versus a bench, I mean, we have specific terms for it. Anywho, I can actually mentally from this distance sense Cyclic's blood pressure building, so I think we might want to desist from this.
No,
one.
I'm fine.
His
I'm
silence.
fine.
It's
Sleep, on the other hand.
Silence is blood pressure building.
Yeah, my blood pressure, on the other hand, is going through the fucking roof.
I'm sure Cyclic does agree with me that the definition of a chair and by extension a cruiser is very much in flux.
Please stop. Please.
I just think that cruiser has been dead. I mean, you can have. I mean, I've had this debate with Cyclic many times as to what kind of capability would potentially allow for a cruiser designation that makes sense to come back into vogue. And the likelihood of that actually happening. But I think as of where things stand at this point in the time, it really is a type of warship that's just been dead for 50 years almost, and it doesn't really have
I would
much
agree.
coherent or constructive role to be using.
Okay. Alright. So, one last question.
I would agree.
One last question. What the hell are the Kirovs then?
The Kiros are hold on.
Oh,
Where's
they're
Red? What's
cruisers.
quote? Hold on.
They're
Where's
nuclear
Redwood?
powered cruisers.
Yeah, I mean, don't forget the Kirovs. The first Kirov was late. They're designed. They're really a 1960s design, to be honest. The first one was laid down in 1974. Kirov herself, and it was just the state of Soviet shipbuilding that they lasted as long as they did in construction. But yeah, no, I mean they're just the leftovers of again. I'd argue that between the two remaining Kirovs and the two remaining Slavers are really the last true examples of cruisers left in service on the planet, reflecting an era when the Soviets did not if they wanted to have an Area A dubbed capability, a true one, they had to build ships that large, much in the same way we did when we were using Terrier or RIM 67 for extended range capability before RIM 66 got to that capability level. But yeah, they're just leftover guided missile cruisers from Cold War. It'd be the equivalent of like if the Italians had actually kept flogging Vittorio Veneto up to the 2020s because they had no ability to retire them and still keep that area AW capability because of limits on shipbuilding capabilities, which is kind of what happened to the Russians post-Soviet collapse. It's because if you look at the Soviets, that's kind of the core problem. They could never build the VLS type combatants destroyers or area AW ships equivalent to what the U.S. Navy, Berks and the Ticos. Granted, the Slavas and the Kirovs did have VLS, but I mean in terms of compact packages, right? They never were able to do that, and their area AW capability they preserved. They basically did by reactivating the cruisers that they were either some of them stayed in service through the whole period, some of them were left lingering, partially stripped, and then were just kind of put back into operable condition. Like Slava herself became Moskva. Because she did not have any real modernization. She was just refurbed into an operable state, which was kind of half her problem. But I don't know if I repeat myself again, but
Okay, after sending everyone on 5 different tangents from me asking a simple question, I think I need to...
Sorry, I was just looking at like Redwood's like I looked at it because he has the word for it in Cyrillic, and the first thing I saw was aren't you bisexual as the first thing I looked up.
What the fuck?
Sorry, it's kind of a
Am I losing...
long story.
Am I losing my mind? Or what's left?
No, Redwood's an interesting person. That's all I'm gonna say. However, he is Russian, so therefore he could actually type the thing that I'm looking for, which is that's the designation for the Kirov. I put it in chat. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's that's it.
I'm back.
Alright. Okay. Right.
What fresh horrors do you want me to introduce you to now?
Okay, so... While I have this very talented host panel who know far more about modern combat than I will ever understand, does anyone have any rapid-fire questions for the next 20 minutes before I keel over sideways from sheer blood loss to my brain? As I am.
Do you have?
I am.
What is your opinion on the transformation of one UK Corps' 2nd Division from an armored division to an infantry division in the 1970s to 1980s period?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
I don't know.
Oh shit! I got a new ship in Canada. Hold on.
I don't know jack shit about that. I am way out of my
Tirpitz?
depth.
What do you mean by torpedoes as strike weapons? Like, what do you mean?
Yes, please elaborate.
Because
Like, you
a
mean-
strike weapon generally refers to land attack.
I mean, hold on.
Ship to ship?
Ship. Okay.
No, just I.
You're probably not getting close enough before you even need a ship missile or even extended range naval gunfire.
Best
Because
case you could
you know.
hope for is a mutual kill because you will be eviscerated by dual-purpose SAMs, generally speaking,
There is only one.
before your
Ah,
torpedo
it's-
even makes it there.
There is only one naval vessel that uses torpedoes in the ship in the modern era. That is a submarine.
Well, there are still some server ships that have capability, but that's besides the point.
How does the
Let's
Canadian
see.
frigate acquisition?
Continue it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to say, it's not really much broken with it at the moment, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of, like, harumping and skies falling over the price tag, but,
I
when
mean,
you
maybe
have
maybe
your
you
budget
call
office
it.
reporting the full life cost of the entire class from the day the first before you start the program to when the last one is scrapped. It's gonna give you a big price tag. I mean, it's the equivalent figure to like the 1.7 trillion for the F-35 program.
The other thing is maybe you actually beat the Navy over the head so they don't call them destroyers. That's about it.
Arnett, that's honestly, I mean, it kind of depends on which class of ballistic missile you're talking about. But frankly, most of them, like the U.S. Navy has the complete sensor shooter capability to deal with them. Technically against really low end capabilities like the how do you say Fateh?
Fata,
The ones the Iranians the Fateh.
The
the
Twa.
110s.
The
Thought I
the
went
ones the Houthis are using right now, right? One thing to keep in mind, because they're very short-range ballistic missiles, they, in some cases, actually have shallower diving angles than certain supersonic diving anti-ship missiles from the Cold War. In particular, KH-22, because we've. I'm gonna have to mute myself because there's radio traffic.
Hi there. I'm not technically not a certified like expert in ballistic missile defense capabilities. I know a little bit about missiles though. Personally speaking, most navies do not have this capability. This includes key nations like the Russians and the Chinese. Anti-ballistic capability is a very broad category because you can get stuff to, like the ICBM capabilities that the US has at the moment to like tactical ballistic missile interception like the SM-3 platform does. You can't still, broadly speaking, it's meant for that BMD, which is the Navy Area Theater Tactical Ballistic Missile Defense. And that's very much basically a sole USN capability in proper at the moment. The nations that are currently working on it and will probably see it first will be the Dutch and then the British. Japan kind of has it. It's not... The big problem with Japan's ballistic missile defense isn't so far as the ships themselves are not capable of such, it's that their inventory is kind of lacking. Japan's procurement of both the SM-3 and the SM-6 have been quite lethargic, to say the very least, and which does make sense because their major person that they're going to be shooting a ballistic missiles from is the North Koreans, which do not particularly have a large capability of launching a mass strike of ballistic missiles. In the meantime, they're a move towards the Indo-Pac. With China, we'll start getting a lot more ballistic missile capability, or missile defense capability, but
Yeah, I mean, one thing I keep in mind, because I guess SM-3 is definitely a much wider area capability than most European nations are really looking at acquiring. But in terms of endo-atmospheric terminal ballistic missile defense, there is kind of a weird line where, because the very good example of this actually is very recently the French frigate Alsace in the Red Sea, where she is a ship that is not supposed to have ballistic missile defense capability, but she defeated 3 tactical ballistic missiles. The reason she was able to do this, which I was trying to get to before I had to mute myself, is the fact that the missiles the Houthis were firing actually were somewhat less challenging targets than some of the diving Soviet supersonic cruise missiles that the ship's air warfare system was designed to be able to counter, because, again, there was calibrated against the cutting-edge threats that the Soviets had at the end of the Cold War. We're going to come out with in the 90s and 2000s.
ballistic.
So a ship that ostensibly doesn't... Sorry?
To go on. I'll continue after you.
Yeah. So even though... So technically speaking, they had this kind of capability, and the capability of the French ship demonstrated something that the British Type 45s could also do. The Horizon-class frigates of the French and Italian navies, the Italian FREM could also do it. When we've seen during formidable field exercises, some of these ships being able to entirely track and would have been able to engage if they had the appropriate shooters, ballistic missiles. And that's really, especially for a lot of European navies, kind of the question is, do you have both the software updates to your combat management system, your weapon control system, to actually properly engage ballistic missile targets? Because a lot of them just aren't programmed to handle those kind of threats unless you can trick them with low-end, short-range ballistic missiles that they are just high-diving cruise missiles. It's a question of are they meant to be able to look at and track those targets that are very high flying if they're ballistic missiles, and also having the appropriate effectors. An example in the case of Europe, the Aster 30 Block 1 NT is really what's meant to be the primary endo-atmospheric interceptor for all the French, the Italian, and the British, or eventually the British and the Italian navies. As of the current upgrade program, the Italians are probably the first ones to get theirs in service in late 2026 or 2027. But things could change because stuff could get accelerated with the stuff going on currently. But otherwise at present there's really not a lot of capability. That's kind of one of the worries for a lot of the action that's going on, say in the Red Sea, but even during the even in 2022, right? Like for example, when the British went onto the Eastern Mediterranean with the Queen Elizabeth and her carrier strike group, the only ship there that was actually capable of countering some of these Soviet anti-ship ballistic missiles that they were flying around with as kind of a taunt was the American destroyer with her, assuming the destroyer had the appropriate interceptors that could have intercepted I think it was Kinzhal they were flying with, but none of the British ships or European ships could.
I think the Dutch are probably gonna get it first. I have no idea about the tempo for the Dutch ones right now, but they've been already like training on SM3, and we'll just start procuring them for the.
Well, SM3 is also not a terminal capability; it's a mid-course.
But it just in terms of general BMD.
Okay, does anyone
Yeah, man.
does anyone in the chat have any additional Modern Warfare questions? Because if not, I'd like to take a quick tangent to answer a very interesting question that Sparkle Ghost for ABC asked that I'm actually equipped to answer for once. If my other members of
I don't think not that one, Marco.
Which Gepards are we talking about? Are we talking about the Corvettes? Are we talking about the air defense, the gun-based air defense vehicles?
Animal review. It's time for animal reviews.
Animal reviews. Oh god. Yeah, because there's quite a few systems in service now named Gepards. So the SPAs. As far as I know, they've done pretty good services, terminal or point defense systems, especially against a lot of the lower-end threats. To be granted, like a lot of the suicide drones and shot heads and stuff like that are things that have been taken out with Maxim guns, but and Blorb, yeah, you can ask questions if you don't know much. I mean, that's the whole point of asking questions.
I just like them in Warno, man.
Okay, can I please quickly?
Yeah,
No.
answer the question on the Hosh. Hosh?
So,
I can't French. I'm sorry.
Crochet.
So the Hosh is she is the bridge. She is the bridge between the French Ironclad era and the French pre-Dreadnought era. She was also the first vessel to be laid down after the brief French spell of we're not going to build any new capital ships because torpedo boats go burr. It was a brief period, but it still existed. She was laid down as part of a class of 4, but her 3 half-sisters were completed to a different design that was the Marceau class. Therefore, she should not have been scrapped before she was built, because she was vital to bridging the gap between the pre-Dreadnought and the Ironclad and the French fleet. Alright, back to modern combat now. And I'm gonna shut up.
Just trying to.
You can ask any question you like within Rambling, provided it's within the rules of the server, and I am technically obligated to attempt to answer it. My fellow co-hosts for this evening are not, but I am technically obligated.
Wait, what do you mean? What? Do you mean I can't answer? I can't ask any questions?
No, you can. No, it's not. That's not what I.
Well, last time this happened, we got the chair conversation. So
No.
Sure, this conversation is a little bit different because it's a philosophical question. It's like the Chinese box theory.
then the nuclear. Oh my god.
You can.
No, okay.
Much to my chagrin, anyone can ask any question they like, provided it's within the rules of the server. I've always maintained that I will attempt to answer if I have some knowledge. It's just
The
that
answer to this one, how do you bend a nuclear control rod, is carelessly or recklessly.
With your hands.
Well, the question is,
okay,
do you
why
want to
are
be
your-
able to do anything afterwards?
very funny.
That's actually okay. To answer. I want to answer the Renat's question. So,
Yeah, go ahead.
the reason why European navies, like the Baltic ones specifically, aren't looking at anti-ballistic missile capabilities because if Russia was threatening the Baltic seas or like the Baltic states, it wouldn't be the Navy dealing with the ballistic missile defense threats. That would be a large contingent of the U.S. Army's air defense elements, which are Patriots, yada yada yada, like that.
Patriot, that sort of deal, yeah.
Yeah, and that is primarily a USAF transported capability into theater. ships are great because you could have them transported everywhere, but specifically for the Baltic states, the Baltic states, there is like, especially now with Sweden now, you can just start positioning like your air defense capability or like air defense units in Sweden, not even in Poland, in Sweden, and then continue to have coverage into the Baltic states and like Kaunas and Vilnius.
Yeah, depending what systems, what threats you're looking at, you're still going to need some Patriot in the Baltics. But,
Yep.
THAAD.
It doesn't have to necessarily sit in like Lithuania.
Yeah.
And also, and just also in granted, Baltic, but in terms of other navies, just because so a lot of it also comes down to funds. I mean, it's one thing for some navies that rely on American technologies to be able to procure from the United States, but say, for example, like if you look at the French and the Italians, they actually have to, they're the ones who have to pay to develop the capabilities that come out of MBDA. MBDA because they're primarily the ones that do this for naval systems. In this case, the Aster family and the radars that get associated with them, which the French and Italians do on their own. And that is something that can come down very much to budget and, how much money can you actually get in a period to get that you can convince your parliaments to fund, which is always really the problem. I mean, in the case of Aster, for example, like the first move to MBDA actually way back when, because there's a very really interesting. It's available online. The French Senate has this whole thing of like when they were looking at ballistic missile capabilities back in 2011, which is where like Aster 30 Block 2 was proposed by MBDA, which was a much more capable endo-atmospheric interceptor. The current Aster 30 Block 1 initiative, which was started closer to like 2014, 2015, is a lower end capability than what they were looking at that point in time. A more achievable one, because again, in line with what you can afford. And the Italians joined that a little bit later on. But this is just, you have to actually be able to get the money to develop these capabilities to make the argument. Like, for example, in the case of the Europeans, one of the big arguments that they had was, what if the Iranians lock the missiles at us? So we need those defensive capabilities to defend Europe against ballistic missile attack. And granted, the United States really is the primary defensive measure against random Iranian ballistic missile attack on American ships and American batteries and the like. But in terms of it having an actual European capability, that was one of the arguments for it. And then also for the ships at sea defending against anti-ship ballistic missiles, that was also part of the argument, because that was kind of seen as this is going to be a threat coming in the future. So we got to be able to counter this, at least make sure we can defend ourselves against this threat. So obviously, if you're like the French Navy and you're trying to do some kind of intervention abroad, or even the Western Mediterranean, right? Because one thing like this, just for the sake of example, Algeria has a rather potent air force and is always looking to acquire spicy capabilities from the Russians. So, what if you are the French Navy and you need to do some kind of action on the Western Mediterranean to deal with the Algerians being uppity over whatever managed to start the conflict? I'm not going to go off these scenarios just for the sake of example. You're going to probably want to have the ability to defeat, Kinzhal if the Russians decide to be a pain in the ass and give the Algerians Kinzhal. Or say, what if the Turks develop a anti-ship ballistic missile capability that they plan to use against the Greeks or anybody who goes in to join and help the Greeks fight, because the French and the Greeks have a mutual defense treaty that exists outside of NATO.
Ooh, that's an interesting question to blurb. Okay, I will answer that one. So the reason why, at least in terms of the surf fleet, we primarily use destroyers is that both it's kind of a weird statement to say that destroyers get one-shotted, because we don't necessarily, they certainly don't really survive getting hit by 10 Lazarums. Nothing does really, if you think about it. But the reason why you want to have distributing forces is, at the very least, in terms of content, like compared to let's say TGX, the strike cruisers. The reason why you really want to have two destroyers over something like a single cruiser is distribution of ISR. Two radar sets, especially if you can distribute them and data link them, is a lot better in terms of getting a clear picture than getting one destroyer. And I will just try to get a graphic
of radar set.
Yeah, but hold on, I'm just trying to get a graphic of this. But it's a really interesting thing, especially with the era of what we call cooperative engagement capability, where hold on. But generally speaking, distributing your your like your information capabilities in two different locations gets you a better picture than one. It's kind of like video games where when you have like a mini map, you combine the two that you see and then your friend sees, and that's your general picture of the battlefield. Basically, you generally just want to have two different locations so you can both triangulate or just have general area coverage. The concept of destroyers being one-shotted and like being like smaller capability vessels is kind of a sensors don't really scale with ship sizes when you okay.
They can to an extent,
Yeah.
but the thing is, practically speaking, you're not going to get much bigger than AMDR, so the Spy 6 that is on the Flight 3 Harley Bergs. Before your returns are wildly not worth it.
Yeah, it's a concept of diminishing returns, and just think of it this way: would you rather have one really powerful radio tower or two really tiny like really not like mediocre
two
radio towers?
Reasonable ones.
Yeah,
you're going to get far better coverage out of the.
I'd also note that this also kind of extends down to your fleet architecture too, right? And how much you can actually afford. So, for example, like if you look at a navy like, say the Royal Navy, right? And they need a certain number of ships to be able to, like, if they, because again, let's say they take the average 3-to-1 ratio, like, you have one ship deployed at sea, you have another ship that's in refit, another ship probably training up and just getting ready to go back at sea after coming out of refit, right? So you have one ship deployed for every 3 ships you have. If you want to do multiple things with those ships, you need to have a certain number of ships to make sure you can always have a certain number of ships deployed or available for various formations. So let's say, you want to have 2 destroyers in a carrier strike group as escort, 1 for an amphibious group, 1 for other tasks. That's 4 destroyers we're talking about now. You're going to want to have at least anywhere from 8 to 12 destroyers in total to maintain having those 4 destroyers always ready for action, active. Now, granted, you can take some of the other destroyers that aren't ready for or aren't active and make them active on very short notice. You can rush them into service, but in terms of in general peacetime operations and just sustainable operations, you want to have that hedge of extra ships just for regular maintenance rotations. Which means that if you're looking at how many ships you want to acquire of a given capability, you might have to say, okay, I could pack twice as many cells with a much larger radar onto this one hull, but then I'm only going to be able to get 4 destroyers out of that whole program with the amount of money I have to work with. Maybe I should seriously look at, a smaller design that I can afford, 6 to 8 of or more, and that might end up determining what you actually get in terms of ships. Now, granted, there's a lot of ins and outs and specifics of the way the math works when it comes to shrinking ships up and down, and which types of ships actually do benefit from increasing volume. For example, carrier capability scales up heavily with volume. You get very, very crap returns from shrinking a carrier down with very little savings, so it's really never advisable. But again, this is also something that whenever your Navy is planning their structure, they have to then go to the guys who hold the purse strings, which is usually your legislature, your parliament or Congress, and justify to them why these choices are being made, because they will always be looking to see how they can save money and not spend as much money on you.
Yeah, but like at least from a pure tactical perspective, there is a certain law of diminishing returns, especially with sensor and missile capabilities. How many hits can a modern ship take? Hey, Richelieu, this is you.
I'm just gonna
That is very dependent on how many they what you're hitting them with.
I'm just gonna.
Yeah.
Is the Richelieu in? I don't think they are, unfortunately.
I'm just going to very quickly jump in to say that I'd like to wrap up, if possible, in about 15 minutes.
I mean, I gotta jump off soon anyways, too, so...
So, if people have any rapid-fire questions they'd like to ask the modern warfare...
I think, hang on.
Now would be the time.
We had, hang on, there's a question further up from Oboyo. Oh boy, there we go. Yeah, which South American navies are the most capable at the moment? I'd say that kind of, So I'd probably say you're looking at something between the Brazilians and the Chileans, as far as capability goes, in terms of just overall size and capability. Because, the Brazilians, I think, are the overall largest navy in the entire hemisphere after the Americans, and they have a reasonably modern submarine fleet. But a lot of what they have, like the frigate fleet, is kind of older. Though they are building new ones with the help of the Germans. And they do have a pretty extensive patrol fleet, but yeah, they're not exactly the hardest hitting in terms of warfighting power. But that's a lot of these South American navies no longer really are. Um,
That's just a
the
dumb
Chileans
artist
actually,
concept, Tirpitz. Nothing beyond that.
but the Chileans actually do have a really pretty darn nice frigate fleet for their, for a navy from the South America. They have two of the old Aussie upgraded Adelaide class frigates, which are, OHPs they built at home. They have the three Type 23s, which they all upgraded those with the Sea Scepter system. They went through a similar upgrade to the British ships. Um, they're pretty capable. They also have an LPG they bought off the French. And they surprisingly have a decent replenishment capability. Not something you often see in smaller navies or South American navies, but they have they bought off a Henry J. Kaiser class replenishment ship off the Americans, which is interesting. A lot more capability than most navies have. Period. Never mind just among South America.
If no one has any additional questions,
Was the peace dividend a mistake? Okay.
It's
What?
not
Hold
really
on.
a question you can answer.
I do like peace, so I will take that as a face value and say I think I like not getting bombed.
I mean, it was
I
always,
can do it in Arma. I can't do it in real life though.
I mean, it was always going to happen. Some sort of drawdown of military spending and military budgets was always going to happen when it always happens when big threats disappear. It always happens. It's been seen
Yeah.
throughout human history. It's not a mistake, it's just a reaction to a new geopolitical situation. We can bitch
Yep.
and moan about
I mean,
it
hey,
all we like,
yeah.
but it was always
Do you
going
ever
to
think that Augustus ever said that? You know, like was the peace dividend ever a mistake? Like during the drawdown of the Roman Empire?
I don't think so, to be honest, but I don't know. I don't know his mind. But yeah, I mean, I think again, it's also gets back to something I kind of touched on before for other specific topics. But in terms of like your military as a whole, any capability you want to keep, you have to justify to whoever's holding the purse strings, right? And for a lot of nations, be this Italy, be this Germany, be this the UK, be this the US, right? Your services would have a very hard time arguing that like we need these high-end capability fleets to go into that we designed to go fight the Soviets in an era where the Soviet Union has collapsed. There's no immediate successor in terms of high-end threat. And because there's just no way you're going to make that argument coherently that they're actually going to listen to you. They want to save money. People want to redirect money against spending as a popular opinion. You're going to have a very hard time fighting that. Really, what you have to do in a scenario is try and figure out what capabilities you want to preserve and focus on those. Which is, the U.S. Navy did a pretty decent job of too. Now, granted, there's definitely probably argument for, and I'd even say like, to an extent, right? You kind of want to cut down on your military spending when it's unproductive too. I mean, in a lot of cases, the money you're spending on your military is not going to productive causes and could be better invested elsewhere if you can get away with it. But
So
then
when's
again,
the
there's also
military
when you look at the
spending?
situation.
Blorb, they do different things. It's not really pros and cons of comparing the two. They just do wildly different things.
You'd also have to
I'd say
there are like broad generalizations. I
You
mean,
don't need to
like
apologize, Blob, by the way. It's
Yeah,
alright to
there's
not
no
know
need to
things.
apologize.
It's alright to not know things. Like I know
I
nothing.
didn't
It's
finish
not
what I was saying.
no, you don't get it. You don't get to speak,
You don't
Phoenix.
get to finish, Phoenix. We're moving on.
God damn it! But I was gonna
Edge in the conversation.
I wanted asshole. But yeah, all I was going to finish with was basically just saying that like there's an argument the peace dividend should have been abandoned earlier, and the second peace dividend that the Bush Jr. administration tried to pull off was probably a mistake. But you could have argued that at the time too. But semantics and there's lots of debates back and forth on that.
Clearly, peace dividend was a mistake. We should have invaded Russia in 1992.
Honestly,
What about China? We should have also taken care of China then.
That's true.
That would have solved a lot. I think you could have had a real peace, Devin, if you solved the Chinese problem then and there. It's like settle the Taiwan question decisively, because that's half the problem with the Taiwan question. It's like they have the ambiguity of it is not an independent nation. It's one China to enforce their claims, or they try and enforce their claims. If you had they're an independent nation. If you want to go to war with them, you will be declaring war on another nation clearly, and that is the way it'll be viewed in the international community. Then the situation will be a little bit easier for us, but.
Just declare
Anywho.
peace dividend. Things made up by the criminally deranged.
I will also I'll also advertise this goddamn like April Fool's joke, which is really nice.
Oh god. Well, folks, that was.
Look, I'm just saying, hypersonic paratroopers is a really funny term.
Yeah. Well, folks.
It sounds like a different way of saying red paste, but I mean,
yes,
each their own.
That was 3 hours and 50 minutes of mostly sanity, with a little bit of insanity there towards the end. I hope you've all found this interesting and enjoyable, and that you've all learned something. Unless anyone has any last-minute questions, I'm gonna wrap this up. Of course, everyone starts typing. I'm never gonna finish.
I'm gonna head out, so I'll see you guys.
Yeah, for those who have turned up new, this is Fleet's Random Ramblings. It's the show I run every Monday. There is a role for it. If you go to the roll center, I will go and grab that now, actually, quickly.
Wait, you don't have it?
No, it was more just I'm gonna grab the link for people.
Oh.
So this is so you just follow that link and grab the Fleet's Random Ramblings role. I also run community events here in the server, so if you want to grab a role for that, I also do that. Run quick as Darth Sidious, don't scare people away, please. It's. I would like to retain an audience. I hope you've all enjoyed yourselves. Cyclic, once again, thank you for coming along. As always, it's been a really interesting.
Yeah, fuck you too.
Come on, I was just. If you're not going to give me a chance to get round to you, Sierra, you won't get thanks. Cyclic was here first. He gets thanked first. Thank you as well, Sierra, for your insightful comments and knowledge.
Oh my gosh, Trent Talenko fell for the UK Defense Journal's April Fools.
No.
He thought they were being serious about buying a third QE.
You're joking.
Nope! He went on a rant about how they don't have enough escorts and that this is stupid without buying more escorts.
Oh,
Look, man, I'm just saying, my art commission got finished, and I'm very happy because it's an anime girl, and I'm giving it to my friends.
Oh man, Trent Tyrelinko.
Oh, did you see the recent Battle Order video, Cyclic?
I saw it pop up. I haven't watched it.
Really funny.
I got a few people this morning with that I DM'd, telling them that the Houthis managed to hit Ike by firing 30 of their shitty little ASBMs and 20 cruise missiles and like 90 one-way attack drones. I got a couple people with that, so.
I'm trying to get the at work I showed my supervisor the SM6 girl I'd commissioned that's in my profile, or like in my profile, and she looked at me. I'm just like, why is she blonde? And I haven't figured out what she meant by that.
Right, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Cyclic and Sierra. Thank you, audience, for once again listening to me descend further into madness. Take care, and I'll see you all next week, if I don't see you sooner than that. Good night.
I'm killing him first.
No, I don't want to die. Wow, you boys really are gluttons for
Well then.
punishment.
Yeah, we are going to commit some war crimes, but it will not war crimes because we win this war.
Fucking hell.
Hello.
Cities are ready to kill some Russians.